Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. When citizens called 911, they expected help. But what if the person responding to their emergency was actually their worst nightmare? Tonight, we explore the dark double life of an officer who betrayed everything his uniform stood for. Asterisk. Detective Marcus Webb had always been the kind of police officer that communities dream of having. Born in 1978 in a small town in Ohio, Marcus grew up in what many would consider the ideal American family. His father worked as a factory supervisor, his mother taught elementary school, and they lived in a modest two-story house with a white picket fence that seemed pulled straight from a Norman Rockwell painting. From an early age, Marcus displayed the qualities that would later make him an exceptional police officer, at least on the surface. He was methodical, observant, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. His high school teachers remembered him as a quiet but brilliant student who excelled in psychology and criminal justice courses. He was the type of young man who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and volunteered at local charity events. After graduating high school with honors, Marcus enrolled in the state university's criminology program. His professors were impressed by his analytical mind and his seemingly genuine desire to serve and protect. He wrote his senior thesis on criminal behavioral patterns, demonstrating an understanding of the criminal mind that was both impressive and, in retrospect, deeply unsettling. Upon graduation, Marcus applied to the Metropolitan Police Department, where he quickly distinguished himself during training. His instructors noted his exceptional marksmanship, his ability to de-escalate tense situations, and his comprehensive understanding of criminal psychology. He graduated at the top of his class and was assigned to the downtown precinct, where he would begin what appeared to be a promising career in law enforcement. For the first 3 years of his career, Marcus was everything the department could have asked for. He had one of the highest case closure rates in his division, was consistently punctual and professional, and maintained excellent relationships with both his colleagues and the community he served. Citizens would specifically request Officer Webb when filing reports, trusting his thorough and compassionate approach to their problems. His personal life seemed equally stable. In 2003, he married Sarah, a nurse he had met while responding to a domestic violence call at the hospital where she worked. Their relationship appeared loving and supportive, with Sarah often speaking proudly of her husband's dedication to justice and protecting others. They purchased a modest home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, complete with a well-maintained garden that Marcus tended to with the same meticulous attention he brought to his police work. Marcus was promoted to detective in 2006, advancement that his superiors felt was well-deserved. He was assigned to the Violent Crimes Unit, where his psychological insights proved invaluable in solving complex cases. His colleagues respected his methodical approach to investigations and his ability to think like the criminals they were pursuing. What they didn't realize was just how literally he could think like them. But beneath this facade of the perfect officer and devoted husband, something dark was beginning to stir. Marcus had always been fascinated by criminal behavior, but this fascination was slowly evolving into something more dangerous. He found himself studying crime scene photos long after his shifts ended, not for professional development, but for a more personal and disturbing reason. He was learning. The first signs of his transformation were subtle. Sarah began noticing that Marcus would sometimes return home from work in an unusually good mood, particularly after investigating violent crimes. When she asked about his day, he would deflect with vague responses about feeling satisfied with a job well done. She attributed this to his dedication to justice, never suspecting the true source of his satisfaction. Marcus also began volunteering for night shifts and weekend overtime, claiming he wanted to make extra money for their future family. In reality, these hours gave him the freedom to explore the darker aspects of his personality without arousing suspicion. His colleagues saw his dedication as admirable, never questioning why he was always so eager to work the most dangerous and disturbing cases. By 2007, Marcus had established himself as one of the department's most reliable and successful detectives. He had a clearance rate that was the envy of his peers, and his insights into criminal behavior had helped solve numerous high-profile cases. The local newspaper had even featured him in an article about dedicated public servants, describing him as a shining example of everything a police officer should be. But the most chilling aspect of Marcus's rise within the department was how his growing knowledge of police procedures and investigative techniques was serving a purpose that had nothing to do with justice. Every crime scene he processed taught him how evidence was collected and analyzed. Every interrogation he conducted showed him how suspects were caught and prosecuted. Every case he solved revealed potential weaknesses in the investigative process. Marcus was not just learning how to catch criminals. He was learning how to be one. The transformation from protector to predator didn't happen overnight. For months, Marcus had been fighting an internal battle between his public persona and his growing dark urges. The turning point came on a cold February night in 2008, during what should have been a routine welfare check. Mrs. Eleanor Hartman, a 67-year-old widow, lived alone in a small apartment on the east side of town. Her daughter, who lived in another state, had been unable to reach her for 3 days and called the police to request a welfare check. Marcus volunteered to take the call, claiming he was familiar with the neighborhood and could handle it efficiently. When Marcus arrived at Mrs. Hartman's apartment building, he found the front door unlocked and the hallways dimly lit. The building was old and poorly maintained, with thin walls that did little to muffle sound. More importantly for Marcus, it was the type of place where residents minded their own business and where screams might be dismissed as arguments between neighbors or sounds from television. Marcus knocked on Mrs. Hartman's door, following standard protocol. When she answered, he was struck by how frail and vulnerable she appeared. She was wearing a faded floral housecoat and seemed disoriented, likely suffering from the early stages of dementia. She didn't question his presence or ask to see his badge, simply stepping aside to let him enter when he explained he was there to check on her welfare. The apartment was small and cluttered, filled with decades of accumulated possessions and the musty smell of a space that wasn't well ventilated. Family photos covered every available surface, showing Mrs. Hartman in happier times with her late husband and children. The television was playing an old movie at low volume, and a half-eaten TV dinner sat on a tray near her chair. As Marcus went through the motions of the welfare check, asking Mrs. Hartman about her health and whether she needed any assistance, he found himself studying her with a different kind of attention. She was completely helpless, utterly trusting of his uniform and badge. She had no way to defend herself and no one who would miss her for days. The realization of how easy it would be to harm her sent an unexpected thrill through his body. Mrs. Hartman offered him tea, shuffling slowly to the kitchen while explaining that she didn't get many visitors and was grateful for the company. As she prepared the tea with shaking hands, Marcus noticed how isolated the apartment was, how the thick walls would muffle any sounds, how the elderly neighbors were likely asleep and wouldn't hear anything unusual. When Mrs. Hartman turned, hand him the cup of tea, something snapped inside Marcus. The careful control he had maintained for years suddenly crumbled, and he found himself grabbing the elderly woman by the throat. Her eyes widened in confusion and terror as she struggled weakly against his grip, the teacup falling to the floor and shattering. What followed was Marcus's first taste of the power and control he had been craving. Mrs. Hartman was completely at his mercy, unable to fight back or call for help. He could see the life draining from her eyes as he squeezed harder, and the sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. For those few minutes, he was completely in control of another person's fate, playing God with her life. When it was over, Marcus found himself standing over Mrs. Hartman's lifeless body, breathing heavily and feeling more alive than he had in years. But almost immediately, his police training kicked in. He knew exactly what needed to be done to avoid detection, and he had the knowledge and resources to do it properly. Marcus spent the next hour carefully staging the scene to look like a natural death. He positioned Mrs. Hartman's body in her chair, making it appear as though she had suffered a heart attack while watching television. He cleaned up the broken teacup and any other evidence of a struggle, using techniques he had learned from countless crime scenes. He even took the time to research her medical history using his police database access, confirming that she had a history of heart problems that would make a cardiac episode plausible. Before leaving, Marcus called for an ambulance and backup, playing the role of the concerned officer who had discovered an elderly woman who had passed away from natural causes. When his colleagues arrived, they found him comforting Mrs. Hartman's confused neighbor and efficiently handling the paperwork. The responding paramedics confirmed that Mrs. Hartman appeared to have died from natural causes, and no investigation was launched. In his official report, Marcus wrote that he had found Mrs. Hartman unresponsive in her chair and that she appeared to have suffered a fatal heart attack. The report was filed without question, and Mrs. Hartman's death was officially classified as natural. Her daughter arranged for the funeral from out of state, never suspecting that her mother had been murdered by the very officer who was supposed to protect her. For Marcus, Mrs. Hartman's death was both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of his internal struggle between good and evil, and the beginning of a killing spree that would terrorize the community for years. He had discovered that he could satisfy his darkest urges while maintaining his public image as a dedicated police officer. More importantly, he had learned that his position gave him nearly unlimited access to potential victims and the perfect cover for his crimes. The most chilling aspect of Mrs. Hartman's murder was how easy it had been. Marcus realized that his badge was not just a symbol of authority, it was a hunting license. People trusted police officers implicitly, opening their doors without question and never suspecting that the person wearing the uniform might be the very danger they feared. In the days following Mrs. Hartman's death, Marcus found himself energized and focused in a way he had never experienced before. His work performance actually improved, as if the release of his violent urges had freed him to excel in other areas of his life. His colleagues noticed his renewed enthusiasm and attributed it to his dedication to serving the community. But Marcus was already planning his next kill. The weeks following Eleanor Hartman's murder were a period of intense self-discovery for Marcus. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, but rather than feeling guilt or remorse, he experienced a sense of liberation. For the first time in his life, he was truly being himself. Even if that self was a monster, Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, volunteering for every difficult case and working long hours that impressed his supervisors. But his dedication had nothing to do with justice. Every crime scene he processed, every investigative technique he learned, and every procedure he mastered was adding to his knowledge of how to commit the perfect crime. He began studying unsolved cases from other jurisdictions, not to help solve them, but to understand what mistakes other killers had made. He analyzed DNA collection procedures to learn how to avoid leaving biological evidence. He studied ballistics reports to understand how firearms could be traced. Most importantly, he observed how investigations were conducted and where the weak points were in the system. Marcus's position in the Violent Crimes Unit gave him access to information that would be invaluable to any criminal. He knew which neighborhoods had the least police coverage, which times of day had the fewest witnesses, and which types of victims were least likely to be missed quickly. He also had access to police schedules, patrol routes, and response times. Information that would help him avoid detection. But perhaps the most valuable asset Marcus possessed was his badge itself. The uniform that had once represented protection and service had become a tool of predation. When Officer Webb knocked on someone's door, they opened it without question. When he asked to come inside, they stepped aside willingly. When he asked personal questions, they answered honestly, never suspecting they were providing information that could be used against them. Marcus began developing what he thought of as his hunting methodology. He would identify potential victims during routine police work, often elderly or isolated individuals who lived alone and had few social connections. He would note their addresses, their daily routines, and their vulnerabilities. Then, during his off-duty hours, he would conduct surveillance to learn more about their habits and determine the best time to strike. His second victim was selected using this careful methodology. Robert Chun was a 58-year-old accountant who lived alone in a modest apartment downtown. Marcus had encountered him during a break-in investigation at Mr. Chin's office building. During their conversation, Marcus learned that Mr. Chun was recently divorced, had no children, and worked long hours that left him socially isolated. Marcus spent 2 weeks studying Mr. Chun's routine. He learned that the man typically worked late on Thursday nights, arriving home around 9 p.m. to an empty apartment building where most residents were elderly and went to bed early. The building had poor lighting and no security cameras, making it an ideal location for Marcus's purposes. The chosen Thursday night, Marcus waited in the parking garage of Mr. Chun's building, wearing civilian clothes but carrying his service weapon. When Mr. Chun arrived home and was walking to the elevator, Marcus approached him, claiming to be conducting a follow-up investigation on the office break-in. Mr. Chun, recognizing the officer who had been helpful during the previous incident, was happy to cooperate. Marcus accompanied Mr. Chun to his apartment, where he claimed he needed to ask a few more questions about the break-in. Once inside, Marcus struck quickly, using his police training to subdue Mr. Chun before he could call for help. Unlike Mrs. Hartman's death, which had been made to look natural, Mr. Chun's murder was staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. Marcus ransacked the apartment, taking Mr. Chun's wallet and some valuable electronics to support the robbery theory. He used gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints and was careful not to leave any other forensic evidence. When he was finished, he left through the building's rear exit, which wasn't covered by the few security cameras in the area. Mr. Chun's body was discovered 2 days later by his building superintendent, who had been asked by Mr. Chun's office to check on him when he failed to show up for work. The responding officers found what appeared to be the aftermath of a violent robbery, with clear signs that the perpetrator had searched for valuables before fleeing. The case was assigned to Marcus's unit, and he volunteered to be the lead investigator. This gave him complete control over the direction of the investigation and allowed him to ensure that no evidence would ever point back to him. He conducted interviews with Mr. Chun's neighbors, colleagues, and the few friends he had, all while knowing that he was the killer they were looking for. Marcus's investigation was thorough and professional, but ultimately fruitless. He followed every lead carefully enough to satisfy his supervisors, while ensuring that none of them would lead to any real suspects. After 3 months, the case was classified as an unsolved robbery homicide, and the file was moved to the cold case archives. The success of Mr. Chun's murder gave Marcus tremendous confidence in his methodology. He had proven that he could not only kill without being caught, but that he could actually lead the investigation into his own crimes. His position as a police officer didn't just provide him with cover. It gave him complete control over the entire process, from selection of victims to disposal of evidence to investigation of the crimes. Over the next several months, Marcus refined his techniques further. He learned to vary his methods to avoid establishing a pattern that might alert other investigators. Some deaths were staged to look natural, others like robberies or random violence. He was careful to space his kills apart and to select victims from different neighborhoods and social circles. Marcus also began to enjoy the psychological aspect of his double life. During the day, he would console grieving families and assure them that everything possible was being done to find their loved one's killer. He would look them in the eye and promise justice, all while knowing that he was the very person they were seeking justice against. The power and control this gave him was intoxicating. By the end of 2008, Marcus had killed 5 people, and not one of the deaths had been connected to the others. In the eyes of his colleagues, supervisors, and the community, he remained the dedicated officer who was working tirelessly to solve these tragic crimes. His clearance rate for other cases remained high, and he was even being considered for another promotion. But Marcus's appetite for killing was growing, and his victims were becoming less random and more personal. He was no longer satisfied with eliminating strangers. He wanted to target people who knew him, people who trusted him, people whose deaths would give him an even greater sense of power and control. The hunter was becoming bolder, and the badge that protected him was making him feel invincible. By early 2009, Marcus had killed 7 people without arousing any suspicion. His confidence had grown to the point where he felt nearly invincible, protected by his badge and his position within the police department. But with this confidence came a dangerous arrogance that would eventually lead to his downfall. Marcus began to crave more than just the act of killing itself. He wanted the psychological satisfaction that came from betraying the trust of people who knew him personally. The anonymous victims had served their purpose in honing his skills, but now he wanted to test whether he could murder someone from his own circle and still maintain his cover. His first target within his personal sphere was Janet Morrison, a 45-year-old single mother who worked as a dispatcher at his police station. Janet had always been friendly with Marcus, often engaging him in conversation during shift changes and expressing admiration for his dedication to solving violent crimes. She trusted him completely, viewing him as one of the good guys who made her proud to work for the police department. Janet lived alone with her 16-year-old daughter, who was heavily involved in school activities and often stayed out late with friends or studying at the library. Marcus had learned Janet's schedule through casual conversations at work, including the fact that Thursday nights were usually when her daughter was at debate team practice until 9 p.m., leaving Janet alone for several hours. On a cold Thursday evening in March, Marcus knocked on Janet's door, claiming he needed her help with a case file that required dispatcher input. Janet welcomed him into her modest home without hesitation, offering him coffee and asking about the case. She was excited to be consulted on police work outside of her regular duties and eager to help solve what Marcus claimed was an important investigation. Marcus's murder of Janet was particularly calculated and cruel. He spent nearly an hour with her, drinking coffee and discussing fictional case details while mentally preparing for what he was about to do. Janet spoke about her daughter, her hopes for the girl's future, and her pride in working for a police department full of dedicated officers like Marcus. The trust and warmth in her voice only added to Marcus's anticipation. When Marcus finally struck, he used a method he had learned from studying crime scenes: manual strangulation that would leave minimal forensic evidence. Janet fought desperately, but Marcus's police training and physical strength gave him a decisive advantage. As the life drained from her eyes, he felt the familiar rush of power and control that had become his addiction. After Janet's death, Marcus staged the scene to look like a break-in robbery. He ransacked the house, took some jewelry and electronics, and broke a window to suggest forced entry. He was careful to use gloves and avoid leaving any biological evidence, drawing on his extensive knowledge of forensic procedures to ensure the scene would support his fabricated narrative. Before leaving, Marcus called 911 from Janet's phone, using a disguised voice to report screams and suspicious activity at her address. Then he drove to a nearby restaurant where he made sure to be seen by the staff, creating an alibi for the time of the murder. When police responded to Janet's home and discovered her body, Marcus was having dinner 3 miles away with a receipt to prove it. The next morning, Marcus volunteered to be part of the investigation into Janet's murder, expressing shock and grief at the loss of a beloved colleague. His emotional response was so convincing that several fellow officers commented on how deeply affected he seemed by Janet's death. He attended her funeral, comforted her daughter, and spoke passionately about the need to find her killer and bring him to justice. Marcus's investigation into Janet's murder was as thorough and professional as his previous efforts. He interviewed neighbors, processed evidence, and followed every lead with apparent dedication. Of course, he ensured that none of these leads would point to the actual killer, but his efforts were impressive enough to earn praise from his supervisors and gratitude from Janet's family. The success of Janet's murder represented a new milestone for Marcus. He had proven that he could kill someone from his own workplace, someone who trusted him completely, and still maintain his cover as a dedicated investigator. The psychological satisfaction of this betrayal was even greater than the physical act of killing itself. Emboldened by this success, Marcus began targeting other people within his extended social circle. His next victim was Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist who had consulted on several of his cases. Dr. Williams had always been impressed by Marcus's insights into criminal behavior, often commenting on his exceptional understanding of the criminal mind. The irony of her admiration for his psychological acuity was not lost on Marcus. Dr. Williams worked late hours at her private practice, often seeing patients until 8 or 9 p.m. in a professional building that was largely empty. After business hours, Marcus used his police credentials to gain access to the building after hours, claiming he needed to review case files for an urgent investigation. The security guard, recognizing Officer Webb from previous visits, allowed him entry without question. Marcus waited in Dr. Williams's office, hidden behind the door when she arrived for her evening appointments. When she entered and turned on the lights, he struck immediately, using a technique that would render her unconscious before she could scream for help. Dr. Williams's murder was particularly brutal, as Marcus took his time to savor the psychological aspects of killing someone who had spent her career studying minds like his. After Dr. Williams's death, Marcus staged the scene to suggest that one of her patients had suffered a psychotic break and attacked her. He had studied her patient files during previous consultations and knew enough about her cases to make this scenario plausible. He even left some of her files scattered around the office to suggest that the killer had been looking for specific information about himself. The investigation into Dr. Williams's murder focused heavily on her patient list, with several individuals with histories of violence being questioned extensively. Marcus participated in these interviews, using his knowledge of the victims' backgrounds to ask probing questions that kept suspicion focused on the patients rather than on the investigative team itself. As 2009 progressed, Marcus's kill count reached double digits, but his methods were becoming increasingly sophisticated and his victim selection more personal. He had murdered a colleague, a professional consultant, and several individuals he had encountered through his police work. Each success made him bolder and more confident in his ability to evade detection. However, Marcus's growing arrogance was beginning to create small cracks in his facade. He started taking unnecessary risks, sometimes revisiting crime scenes during his off-duty hours to relive the experience. He began keeping small trophies from his victims, items that wouldn't be missed, but that gave him psychological satisfaction. Most dangerously, he started engaging in conversations about his cases with other officers, offering insights that were perhaps too detailed and accurate for someone who hadn't been present during the actual crimes. These warning signs were subtle and went largely unnoticed by his colleagues, who still viewed Marcus as one of their most dedicated and effective investigators. But somewhere in the back of his mind, Marcus was beginning to realize that his double life was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The hunter was becoming hunted, even if he didn't yet know it. The question was whether his growing recklessness would catch up with him before he could claim even more victims. By 2010, Marcus Webb had been living his double life for over 2 years, and the psychological toll was beginning to manifest in ways he hadn't anticipated. While he felt no remorse for his victims, the constant need to maintain his facade as a dedicated police officer was becoming increasingly exhausting. The cognitive dissonance between his public persona and his private reality was creating stress. Fractures in his carefully constructed identity, Marcus's behavior at work, began to show subtle changes that his more observant colleagues started to notice. He had always been methodical and thorough, but now he seemed almost obsessively focused on certain details of violent crime cases. He would spend hours poring over crime scene photos, ostensibly looking for clues, but his intense fascination with the imagery seemed to go beyond professional necessity. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who had been Marcus's partner for 6 months, began to notice these behavioral quirks. During their investigation of a particularly brutal home invasion, she observed Marcus studying photographs of the victim's injuries with what seemed like inappropriate interest. When she mentioned this to him, Marcus quickly deflected, claiming he was trying to understand the killer's psychological profile, but Lisa found his explanation unsatisfying. Lisa also noticed that Marcus seemed to have an unusual knowledge of forensic countermeasures for someone whose specialty was supposed to be investigation rather than crime scene analysis. During discussions about evidence collection, he would sometimes offer insights about how killers might avoid detection that seemed to come from a perspective beyond academic study. His knowledge was too practical, too specific, too personal. The turning point came during the investigation of a case that hit particularly close to home for Marcus. A serial killer had been targeting women in the downtown area, using methods that were remarkably similar to some of Marcus's own techniques. The killer was careful about forensic evidence, varied his methods to avoid establishing a clear pattern, and seemed to have knowledge of police procedures that suggested possible law enforcement training. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of investigating crimes that mirror his own methodology. As the lead detective on the case, he was expected to develop a psychological profile of the unknown killer, essentially describing himself to his colleagues and superiors. The irony was not lost on him, but it also created a dangerous situation where his insights might be too accurate, too revealing. During one team meeting, Marcus presented his analysis of the downtown killer's psychological profile. He described someone who was intelligent, methodical, and likely had some connection to law enforcement or the criminal justice system. His profile was remarkably accurate, drawing praise from supervisors and FBI consultants who had been brought in to assist with the case. But Detective Rodriguez noticed something troubling about Marcus's presentation. His description of the killer's mindset seemed to come from an internal understanding rather than external analysis. He spoke about the killer's motivations and thought processes with a confidence that suggested personal experience rather than professional deduction. When Lisa asked him after the meeting how he had developed such detailed insights, Marcus's explanation was vague and unsatisfactory. Lisa began conducting her own informal investigation into her partner's background and behavior. She reviewed the cases Marcus had worked on over the past 2 years, looking for patterns or inconsistencies that might explain her growing suspicions. What she discovered was disturbing, though not yet conclusive. Marcus had been the primary or secondary investigator on an unusually high number of unsolved murders. While this could be explained by his reputation as a thorough and capable detective, Lisa noticed that many of these cases had similarities in methodology and victim selection. That suggested they might be connected. More troubling, Marcus seemed to have insights into these cases that went beyond what the evidence should have provided. Lisa also discovered that Marcus had requested access to evidence lockers and case files during off-duty hours on multiple occasions. When she checked the logs, she found that his access times often coincided with periods when new evidence had been collected or when breakthroughs in investigations were being made. It was as if he was monitoring the progress of investigations in real time, not just during his assigned shifts. The most damning evidence Lisa uncovered was a pattern in Marcus's whereabouts during the time periods when several murders had occurred. By cross-referencing his duty schedules with the estimated times of death for various victims, she found that Marcus had been off-duty or on flexible assignments during each of the time windows when the murders could have taken place. Lisa faced a terrible dilemma. Her suspicions about Marcus were based on circumstantial evidence and behavioral observations that could have innocent explanations. Accusing a fellow officer of being a serial killer was a career-ending move if she was wrong, but remaining silent could cost more lives if she was right. She needed more concrete evidence before she could take her concerns to their supervisor. Lisa began monitoring Marcus more closely, noting his behavior during investigations and his reactions to new developments in various cases. She also started documenting his whereabouts during off-duty hours, though she had to be careful not to arouse his suspicion by being too obvious about her surveillance efforts. Meanwhile, Marcus was beginning to sense that something had changed in his relationship with his partner. Lisa's questions seemed more pointed, her observations more critical, and her overall demeanor more suspicious. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what had triggered her change in attitude, but his survival instincts, honed by years of maintaining his double life, were telling him that Lisa Rodriguez might be becoming a problem. Marcus began conducting counter-surveillance on his partner, trying to determine whether she was investigating him or simply becoming more cautious in her police work. He noticed that she was reviewing old case files during her lunch breaks, files that seemed to focus on unsolved murders rather than their current active cases. He also observed that she was asking other officers subtle questions about his background and work history. The psychological pressure on Marcus was intensifying from multiple directions. He was dealing with the stress of investigating crimes similar to his own, managing a partner who was becoming increasingly suspicious, and maintaining his public facade while continuing to feed his addiction to killing. The careful balance he had maintained for 2 years was beginning to collapse. In December 2010, Marcus made a decision that would prove to be his undoing. Rather than scaling back his activities or finding ways to deflect Lisa's suspicions, he decided that his partner had become too dangerous to ignore. If Lisa Rodriguez was investigating him, there was only one way to permanently end that threat. Marcus began planning his most dangerous murder yet, the killing of a fellow police officer who knew him well and whose death would trigger the most intensive investigation of his career. It was a risk that demonstrated just how far his arrogance and addiction had progressed, and how completely he had lost touch with the reality of his situation. The hunter was about to make the mistake that would finally expose him. But he was too intoxicated by his own power to see the trap he was setting for himself. The decision to kill Detective Lisa Rodriguez represented the culmination of Marcus's transformation from protector to predator. For over 2 years he had successfully maintained his double life by carefully selecting victims who wouldn't be missed quickly and staging scenes that deflected suspicion away from him. But now, driven by paranoia and an addiction to killing that had grown beyond his control, he was preparing to cross a line that would almost certainly lead to his destruction. Marcus spent weeks planning Lisa's murder with the same methodical approach he had used for his previous victims, but with an additional layer of complexity. Killing a fellow police officer would trigger the most intensive investigation possible, involving multiple agencies and the best investigative minds in the state. Every aspect of the crime would be scrutinized with unprecedented thoroughness, leaving no room for the small mistakes that might have been overlooked in previous cases. But Marcus's arrogance had reached such heights that he believed he could outwit even this level of scrutiny. He convinced himself that his insider knowledge of police procedures and his position as a lead investigator would allow him to control the investigation and guide it away from him. Just as he had done with his previous crimes, Marcus's plan for Lisa's murder was elaborate and multi-layered. He would stage her death to look like the work of the downtown serial killer they had been investigating, creating a connection that would focus the investigation on external suspects rather than on the investigative team itself. He had studied the unknown killer's methodology extensively and was confident he could replicate it convincingly. The opportunity Marcus had been waiting for came on a cold Friday evening in January 2011. Lisa had been working late, reviewing case files for their ongoing investigation into the downtown murders. She had mentioned during their shift that she planned to stay at the office until at least 8 p.m. to finish her analysis of the evidence they had collected during the week. Marcus volunteered to stay late as well, claiming he wanted to review his own notes and prepare for a meeting with FBI consultants the following Monday. This gave him the perfect opportunity to be alone with Lisa in the largely empty police station, where security cameras had blind spots that he had noted during his years of working there. At approximately 7:45 p.m., Marcus approached Lisa's desk, under the pretense of discussing a detail from one of their cases. Lisa looked up from her work, and Marcus could see the suspicion in her eyes that had been growing for weeks. She was careful in her responses to his questions, as if she suspected his motives for the conversation. What happened next unfolded with the brutal efficiency that Marcus had perfected over his years of killing. Using his police training and the element of surprise, he rendered Lisa unconscious before she could call for help or activate any emergency alarms. The attack was swift and silent, taking place in a corner of the detective bureau where the security cameras couldn't record the assault. But even as Marcus was committing the murder that would finally satisfy his twisted psychology, he was making mistakes that would ultimately lead to his downfall. In his excitement and overconfidence, he failed to notice that Lisa had been more prepared for this confrontation than he realized. Detective Rodriguez had suspected for weeks that Marcus might try to harm her, and she had taken precautions that he wasn't aware of. She had been secretly recording conversations with him using a small digital recorder, hoping to capture incriminating statements that would support her growing suspicions. More importantly, she had arranged for a colleague to check on her at 8 p.m. if she didn't call to confirm she was leaving the office safely. When Detective James Morrison arrived at the station at 8:15 p.m. to check on Lisa, he found the detective bureau empty, except for Marcus, who was sitting at his desk apparently working on case files. Marcus calmly explained that Lisa had left about 30 minutes earlier, claiming she had finished her work and gone home for the weekend. But Morrison noticed several details that didn't align with Marcus's story. Lisa's purse was still in her desk drawer, her car was still in the parking lot, and her computer was still logged in with case files open on the screen. Most importantly, Lisa had left her service weapon in her desk, something no police officer would do when leaving the station. Morrison's suspicions were aroused, but he decided to investigate further before confronting Marcus directly. He called Lisa's cell phone and got no answer, then called her apartment and spoke to her answering machine. He also checked with the security guard to see if anyone had observed Lisa leaving the building, but no one had seen her depart. Meanwhile, Marcus was frantically trying to complete the disposal of Lisa's body and the cleanup of evidence from his crime. He had moved her body to a storage area in the basement of the police station, planning to transport it to a location where it could be staged to look like the work of the downtown serial killer. But the unexpected arrival of Detective Morrison had disrupted his timeline and created complications he hadn't anticipated. When Morrison began asking more pointed questions about Lisa's whereabouts and making calls to other officers to help locate her, Marcus realized that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. He needed to act quickly to maintain his cover, but every decision he made from this point forward would either save him or destroy him. Marcus made the fatal decision to double down on his deception rather than abort his plan. He told Morrison that he was also concerned about Lisa's unusual behavior and suggested they should search the building together to make sure she hadn't collapsed somewhere or suffered a medical emergency. This suggestion seemed helpful and concerned, but it was actually Marcus's attempt to control the search and guide Morrison away from areas where evidence of his crime might be discovered. As they searched the upper floors of the police station, Marcus was mentally calculating how much time he had before Lisa's body would be discovered, and how he could position himself to avoid suspicion. But his criminal psychology, which had served him so well in selecting and killing victims, was poorly suited to the improvisation required for damage control in a rapidly deteriorating situation. The search took on an increasingly urgent tone. As more officers arrived to help look for their missing colleague, Marcus found himself in the surreal position of leading a search for a woman he had murdered less than an hour earlier, expressing concern and offering theories about where she might have gone. But with each passing minute, his situation became more precarious. The end came swiftly and unexpectedly. Detective Morrison, who had been growing increasingly suspicious of Marcus's explanations and behavior, decided to check the building's security footage to see if the cameras had captured Lisa leaving the building. What he discovered on the recordings was footage of Marcus attacking Lisa in the corner of the detective bureau, where a camera angle he had thought was blocked actually provided a partial view of the assault. When Morrison called for backup and moved to arrest Marcus, the facade that had protected him for over 2 years finally crumbled completely. Faced with irrefutable video evidence of his attack on Detective Rodriguez, Marcus realized that his double life was over. But even then, his arrogance prevented him from understanding the full scope of his exposure. Marcus initially tried to claim that he had attacked Lisa in self-defense, alleging that she had discovered his involvement in corruption and had threatened to expose him unless he shared information about ongoing investigations. It was a desperate lie that fell apart under the most basic scrutiny, but it demonstrated how disconnected from reality Marcus had become. The search for Lisa's body led investigators to the basement storage area where Marcus had hidden her, and forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed evidence that would connect him not only to Lisa's murder but to several of his previous victims. In his haste and panic, Marcus had made mistakes that his methodical planning had previously helped him avoid. The arrest of Detective Marcus Webb sent shockwaves through the police department and the community he had served for over a decade. The revelation that a trusted officer had been systematically murdering citizens while investigating his own crimes challenged everything people believed about safety, justice, and the institutions meant to protect them. The investigation into Marcus's crimes became one of the largest and most complex police operations in the state's history. Detectives from multiple agencies worked around the clock to review every case Marcus had been involved with, every crime scene he had processed, and every victim whose death he had investigated. What they discovered painted a picture of predation and betrayal that was almost too disturbing to comprehend. Forensic analysts found Marcus's DNA at 3 crime scenes where it shouldn't have been, evidence that had been overlooked in the original investigations, but became damning when viewed in the context of his arrest. They also discovered that Marcus had been accessing police databases to research potential victims, using his law enforcement credentials to gather personal information about people he was planning to kill. Perhaps the most chilling discovery was a collection of trophies Marcus had taken from his victims, small personal items that he had kept as mementos of his crimes. These items were found hidden in his home office, carefully cataloged and preserved like a hunter's collection of trophies. Each item told a story of trust betrayed and life extinguished by someone who had sworn to protect and serve the investigation. also revealed the sophisticated methods Marcus had used to avoid detection. He had exploited his knowledge of forensic procedures to eliminate evidence, his understanding of investigative techniques to misdirect suspicion, and his position within the police department to control the very investigations that should have caught him. His crimes represented not just individual acts of violence, but a systematic corruption of the justice system itself. As the scope of Marcus's crimes became clear, families of his victims were faced with the devastating realization that their loved ones had been murdered by the very officer who had promised to find their killer. The psychological trauma of this betrayal was almost as damaging as the original loss, destroying their faith in law enforcement and leaving them feeling utterly abandoned by the system. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had been Marcus's final victim, but her death also proved to be his undoing. The evidence she had been gathering about his suspicious behavior, combined with the video footage of her murder, provided investigators with the breakthrough they needed to connect Marcus to his other crimes. In death, she had achieved the justice she had been seeking in life. The trial of Marcus Webb became a media sensation, with every detail of his double life being scrutinized by prosecutors, defense attorneys, and a horrified public. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including DNA evidence, video footage, witness testimony, and his collection of victim trophies. But perhaps the most damning evidence was Marcus's own words, recorded during police interrogations where his narcissism and lack of remorse were on full display. Asterisk. Marcus showed no emotion during the reading of charges that included 12 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of evidence tampering, and numerous violations of his oath as a police officer. When given the opportunity to address the court, he expressed no remorse for his victims or their families, instead complaining about what he claimed was unfair treatment by the media and the justice system. The psychological evaluation of Marcus revealed a complex personality disorder characterized by narcissism, antisocial behavior, and a complete lack of empathy for others. Experts testified that his choice of law enforcement as a career was likely motivated not by a desire to serve others, but by a need for power and control that eventually evolved into a compulsion to kill. The impact of Marcus's crimes extended far beyond his individual victims. The police department was forced to undergo a complete review of its hiring practices, psychological screening procedures, and oversight systems. Public trust in law enforcement, already fragile in many communities, was severely damaged by the revelation that an officer had been able to commit serial murders while maintaining an exemplary professional reputation. New protocols were implemented, requiring regular psychological evaluations for all officers, mandatory reporting of concerning behavior by colleagues, and enhanced oversight of evidence handling and case investigations. But for many in the community, these changes felt like too little, too late. Marcus Webb was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that provided some measure of justice for his victims' families, but could never undo the damage he had caused. His case became a textbook example of how positions of trust and authority could be exploited by individuals with criminal intent, and how the very systems designed to catch criminals could be corrupted from within. The case of Detective Marcus Webb forced an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, authority, and the capacity for evil that can exist behind a badge of honor. In the months following his conviction, grief counselors worked with victims' families. Police departments across the country reviewed their own screening procedures, and criminologists studied the case to understand how such a betrayal could occur. For the families of Marcus's victims, the revelation of his identity brought a complex mix of relief and renewed trauma. They finally had answers about what had happened to their loved ones, but those answers came with the devastating knowledge that the person they had trusted to find justice had been the killer all along. Many reported feeling a sense of violation that went beyond the original crimes, as if they had been victimized twice, once by the murder and again by the deception. Sarah Webb, Marcus's wife, became an unintended victim of his crimes. She had lived with a monster for years without knowing his true nature, trusting in the goodness of a man who was systematically destroying the lives of others. The psychological trauma of learning about her husband's double life required years of therapy and forever changed her ability to trust others. The police department where Marcus had worked faced intense scrutiny from the media, the public, and oversight agencies. Internal investigations revealed that while Marcus had been skilled at hiding his crimes, there had been warning signs that might have been detected with better training and more robust oversight procedures. Several colleagues reported having felt uneasy about his behavior in retrospect, but none had felt confident enough in their suspicions to report them formally. Detective James Morrison, who had discovered the evidence that led to Marcus's arrest, struggled with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that he might have prevented some deaths if he had acted on his suspicions about Marcus earlier. He eventually left law enforcement and became an advocate for improved police training and psychological support services. The case also sparked broader discussions about the psychological screening of law enforcement officers and the need for ongoing mental health support throughout police careers. Experts pointed out that while most officers serve honorably throughout their careers, the authority and access that comes with the badge creates unique opportunities for those with criminal intent. Marcus Webb himself remained unrepentant even after his conviction, continuing to maintain that he had been unfairly targeted and that his crimes were being sensationalized by the media. His lack of remorse and inability to acknowledge the suffering he had caused reinforced the psychological evaluations that had diagnosed him as having severe antisocial personality disorder. In prison, Marcus was placed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and his former status as a police officer. He spent his days reading legal texts and writing appeals that were routinely rejected by the courts. Guards reported that he showed no signs of rehabilitation or recognition of wrongdoing, instead displaying the same narcissistic personality traits that had enabled his crimes. The Detective Rodriguez Foundation was established in memory of the officer who had given her life to expose Marcus's crimes. The foundation provided support for families of crime victims and funded research into criminal behavior within law enforcement agencies. Detective Rodriguez was posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor for her courage in investigating a colleague. Despite the personal risk involved, criminal justice programs across the country began using Marcus Webb's case as a teaching tool to help future law enforcement officers recognize warning signs of corruption and criminal behavior among their colleagues. The case demonstrated the importance of creating environments where officers feel safe reporting concerns about their peers and the need for systems that can detect patterns of suspicious behavior. The community that Marcus had terrorized slowly began to heal, but the scars left by his betrayal would never fully disappear. Many residents reported lasting changes in their relationship with law enforcement, finding it difficult to trust police officers even when they knew logically that Marcus was an anomaly rather than representative of law enforcement as a whole. Years later, criminologists and psychologists continued to study Marcus's case, trying to understand how someone could maintain such a convincing facade while committing such heinous crimes. His ability to compartmentalize his personality, manipulate others' perceptions, and exploit his position of trust made him a particularly dangerous type of criminal. The case served as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind any facade, including the uniforms and badges that society relies on for protection. It demonstrated the importance of vigilance, oversight, and the courage to speak up when something seems wrong, even when doing so means challenging authority or questioning trusted institutions. When citizens called 911, they expected help. In Marcus Webb's case, they got their worst nightmare instead. His story stands as a testament to the importance of the oath, that law enforcement officers take to protect and serve, and the devastating consequences when that oath is not just broken, but completely perverted. The badge that should have represented safety became a weapon. The uniform that should have brought comfort brought terror instead. And the man who should have been the solution became the very problem he was supposed to solve. This is why we must never stop questioning, never stop watching, and never assume that a position of authority automatically makes someone worthy of our absolute trust. Because sometimes, the person we're counting on to save us is the very person we need to be saved from. In the summer of 2019, what should have been the happiest day of Emma Richardson's life became the beginning of a mystery that would haunt an entire community. Emma, 28, was a beloved elementary school teacher known for her infectious laugh and kind heart. She was set to marry her college sweetheart, David Chun, in what friends described as a fairy tale romance. The wedding was planned for a Saturday afternoon at the historic Riverside Manor, a picturesque venue overlooking the lake where David had proposed 2 years earlier. Everything seemed perfect. Emma had spent months carefully planning every detail, from the vintage lace dress that had belonged to her grandmother to the handwritten vows she had practiced reading aloud. On the morning of the wedding, Emma was getting ready with her bridesmaids when she received a phone call that seemed to upset her greatly. Her maid of honor, Jessica, later told police that Emma's face went pale during the conversation, and she seemed shaken. When asked what was wrong, Emma said it was nothing important, and that she needed to step outside for some fresh air. That was the last time anyone saw Emma Richardson alive. When she failed to return after an hour, the bridal party began searching the grounds. They found Emma's cell phone near the garden gazebo, but there was no sign of struggle or indication of where she might have gone. Her car was still in the parking lot, her purse was in the bridal suite, and her wedding dress hung waiting, never to be worn. The investigation revealed that the mysterious phone call had come from an unknown number, and the caller's identity remained a puzzle. Phone records showed the call lasted only 3 minutes, but what was said during those crucial moments remained unknown. The phone itself was traced to a prepaid device that had been purchased with cash, leaving no digital trail to follow. As hours turned to days, the search for Emma intensified. Divers combed the lake, search dogs tracked through miles of surrounding forest, and volunteers distributed flyers throughout the region. But Emma had simply vanished, as if she had never existed at all. The investigation took a dark turn when police discovered that Emma had been receiving threatening letters for several weeks before her wedding. The letters, written in block print to disguise the handwriting, contained disturbing messages about how Emma didn't deserve happiness, and how her perfect life was about to end. Emma had never reported these letters to police, apparently not wanting to worry her family during what should have been a joyful time. Further investigation revealed that Emma had been having doubts about her relationship with David. Close friends disclosed that she had confided concerns about David's controlling behavior and his jealousy regarding her friendships with male colleagues. She had mentioned feeling suffocated and had even considered postponing the wedding. Though she had never voiced these concerns publicly, David himself became a person of interest when inconsistencies emerged in his alibi for the time of Emma's disappearance. He claimed to have been with his groomsmen preparing for the ceremony, but several witnesses placed him away from the group during the crucial time window. When questioned, David became defensive and eventually hired a lawyer, refusing to speak further with investigators. The case took another twist when Emma's body was discovered 6 months later by hunters in a remote forest area 30 miles from the wedding venue. The location was so isolated that it would have been impossible for Emma to reach on foot, and the condition of the remains suggested she had been there since shortly after her disappearance. Forensic analysis revealed that Emma had died from blunt force trauma to the head, indicating she had been murdered. DNA evidence found on her clothing led to the arrest of Marcus Patterson, a former student's parent who had developed an obsession with Emma after she had reported his inappropriate behavior to school administrators the previous year. Patterson had been sending the threatening letters and had been stalking Emma for months, learning her routines and planning his attack. On the day of the wedding, he had called her with false information about a family emergency, luring her away from the safety of her bridal party to a secluded area where he attacked her. During his confession, Patterson revealed a disturbing level of planning and premeditation. He had studied Emma's schedule, knew about her wedding plans, and had specifically chosen that day because he wanted to destroy what he saw as her perfect life. The randomness of his selection of Emma as a victim made the crime even more chilling. Marcus. Patterson was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but the damage to Emma's family and friends was irreversible. David struggled with guilt over the relationship issues they had been having, wondering if things might have been different if he had taken her concerns about the threatening letters more seriously. The case highlighted the vulnerability that exists even during life's happiest moments and the importance of reporting threatening behavior before it escalates to violence. The suburban neighborhood of Maple Heights prided itself on being the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and children played safely in the streets until dark. Tree-lined avenues were dotted with well-maintained homes, and neighbors genuinely cared about each other's well-being. It was the embodiment of the American dream, which made what happened there all the more shocking. At the heart of this community lived Robert Hendricks, a 45-year-old software engineer who seemed to epitomize everything a perfect neighbor should be. He maintained the most beautiful garden on the block, helped elderly residents with yard work, and organized the annual neighborhood barbecue. Children adored him, parents trusted him, and everyone considered themselves lucky to live near such a kind and generous man. Robert had moved to Maple Heights 5 years earlier after what he described as a difficult divorce. He spoke little about his past, preferring to focus on building new relationships in his adopted community. His modest 2-story home became a gathering place for neighborhood events, and his door was always open to anyone who needed help or just wanted to chat. What no one knew was that Robert Hendricks was not his real name, and his carefully constructed identity was hiding a dark and violent past. The man they trusted with their children and welcomed into their homes was actually Thomas Brennan, a convicted child predator who had been released from prison 3 years earlier. After serving a reduced sentence, Thomas had spent his time in prison learning how to avoid detection when he was released. He studied identity theft, researched small communities where background checks might be less thorough, and developed a persona that would make him appear trustworthy and harmless. Maple Heights had been his target from the beginning, chosen specifically because of its family-friendly atmosphere and trusting residents. For 2 years, Thomas maintained his facade perfectly, gradually building relationships and establishing himself as an integral part of the community. He was patient, methodical, and careful never to do anything that would arouse suspicion. But beneath the surface, he was studying his neighbors, learning their routines, and identifying potential victims. The first sign that something was wrong came when 8-year-old Sophie Martinez began exhibiting behavioral changes that concerned her parents. Sophie, normally an outgoing and cheerful child, became withdrawn and anxious. She had nightmares, refused to play outside, and seemed afraid of going near certain houses in the neighborhood. When Sophie's mother, Maria, gently questioned her daughter about what was bothering her, Sophie initially refused to say anything. But eventually, in broken sentences and with obvious distress, she revealed that Mr. Robert had been asking her to come inside his house when her parents weren't watching, and that he had shown her things that made her uncomfortable. Maria Martinez immediately contacted the police, who began a careful investigation into Robert Hendricks' background. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. Not only was Robert actually Thomas Brennan, a registered sex offender, But he had violated the terms of his parole by living in proximity to schools and playgrounds and by failing to register his address with authorities. When police searched Thomas's home, they found a disturbing collection of photographs taken secretly of children in the neighborhood. The images showed kids playing in their yards, walking to school, and engaging in normal childhood activities, but they had been taken with telephoto lenses from hidden positions and cataloged with detailed notes about each child's routines and habits. More disturbing was the discovery of a detailed journal in which Thomas had recorded his observations of various children, rating them based on their vulnerability and accessibility. He had been planning for months, using his position as a trusted neighbor to study potential victims and identify opportunities for abuse. The investigation revealed that Thomas had been grooming several children in addition to Sophie, using his reputation as a kind neighbor to gain their trust and that of their parents. He had been offering candy, video games, and special attention to children who seemed lonely or in need of positive adult interaction. As news of Thomas Brennan's true identity spread through Maple Heights, the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. Parents realized they had unknowingly placed their children in danger by trusting someone who had seemed so genuine and caring. Many questioned their ability to judge character and struggled with guilt over their vulnerability to manipulation. Case also revealed systemic failures in the monitoring of released sex offenders. Thomas had been required to check in with a parole officer monthly, but the meetings were perfunctory and no one had verified his living situation or investigated his integration into the community. His false identity had gone undetected because no one had thought to look closely at someone who appeared so trustworthy. Thomas Brennan was sentenced to 25 years in prison for violations of his parole and for the abuse he had inflicted on children in Maple Heights. The judge noted that his calculated deception and manipulation of an entire community demonstrated a level of predatory behavior that warranted the maximum possible sentence. The Maple Heights community was forever changed by the revelation of Thomas's true nature. Neighbors who had once left their doors unlocked began installing security systems. Parents who had allowed their children to play freely began supervising them constantly. The trust that had been the foundation of their community was shattered, replaced by suspicion and vigilance. But the case also demonstrated the importance of listening to children when they express concerns about adult behavior, even when those adults seemed trustworthy. Sophie Martinez's courage in speaking up about her discomfort prevented Thomas from claiming additional victims and ultimately led to his capture. The perfect neighbor had been a predator in disguise, but the community's response showed that even when trust is betrayed, people can come together to protect the most vulnerable among them. The old Victorian house at 1247 Elm Street had stood empty for 3 years when the Morrison family decided to buy it. The realtor had been honest about the house's history. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Constance Whitmore, had died there under somewhat mysterious circumstances. But the price was right, and the family needed space for their growing household. Sarah and Michael Morrison moved in with their 2 teenage children, believing they were getting a bargain on a beautiful historic home. The house needed work, but it had good bones and enormous potential. What they didn't expect were the sounds that began occurring almost immediately after they moved in. It started with footsteps in the attic late at night, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. Then came the sound of doors opening and closing when no one was upstairs. The family initially attributed these noises to the old house settling or perhaps mice in the walls, but the sounds were too rhythmic and purposeful to be explained by natural causes. Their 16-year-old daughter, Ashley, was the first to see him. She woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone moving around in the hallway outside her bedroom. When she peered out her door, she saw the silhouette of a man standing at the top of the stairs, perfectly still, as if he was listening for something. When she blinked, he was gone. Ashley told her parents about the sighting, but they attributed it to a nightmare or her imagination. Old houses could play tricks on people, especially at night when shadows and creaking sounds could be misleading. They assured her that the doors were locked and the security system was armed, making it impossible for anyone to be inside the house. But the incidents continued and escalated. Family members began finding their personal belongings moved or rearranged. Pictures would be turned face down, books would be stacked in different orders, and clothing would be found in rooms where it didn't belong. The disturbances always occurred at night, and whoever was responsible was careful never to damage anything or leave obvious evidence of their presence. Michael Morrison began staying up late, hoping to catch whoever was responsible for the mysterious activity. He installed additional security cameras throughout the house and checked them religiously every morning. But the cameras never captured anything unusual, showing only empty hallways and undisturbed rooms throughout the night. The breakthrough came when Sarah Morrison decided to research the history of their house more thoroughly. She discovered that Constance Whitmore, the previous owner, had died under circumstances that were more mysterious than the realtor had indicated. The elderly woman had been found dead in her bedroom, apparently from natural causes, but neighbors had reported seeing lights in the house and hearing sounds for weeks after her death. More disturbing was Sarah's discovery that the house had a history of unexplained incidents dating back decades. Previous owners had reported similar experiences, mysterious sounds, belongings being moved, and the sense that someone was living in the house without permission. Several families had moved out suddenly, citing irreconcilable differences with the property. The truth about their midnight visitor was revealed when Michael decided to search areas of the house they hadn't fully explored. In the basement, behind a panel that appeared to be part of the wall, he discovered a hidden room that had been converted into a primitive living space. The room contained a mattress, canned food, water bottles, and personal hygiene items. Most disturbing of all were dozens of photographs of the Morrison family taken inside their home, showing them sleeping, eating, and going about their daily activities. The photographs revealed that someone had been living in their house since they moved in, using the hidden room as a base while moving freely through the main house at night. The intruder had been watching them, studying their routines, and documenting their lives without their knowledge. The cameras Michael had installed had been carefully avoided by someone who clearly understood their locations and viewing angles. Police set up surveillance to catch the intruder, and within a week they arrested Harold Vance, a 52-year-old drifter who had been homeless for several years. Harold had discovered the hidden room while the house was empty and had been using it as shelter. When the Morrison family moved in, rather than leave, he had adapted to sharing the space, becoming a secret roommate who emerged only when the family was asleep. Harold's possession of detailed knowledge about the family's routines and personal habits was deeply disturbing. He knew what time each family member went to bed, what their favorite foods were, and even intimate details about their relationships and personal struggles. He had been listening to their conversations and observing their private moments for months. The investigation revealed that Harold had been responsible for similar intrusions in other homes over the years. He was skilled at finding hidden spaces in old houses and had developed techniques for moving through homes undetected. His method was to study families carefully, learning their routines so thoroughly that he could predict their movements and avoid confrontation. Harold Vance was charged with breaking and entering, stalking, and invasion of privacy. During his interrogation, he showed little remorse for his actions, claiming that he had never intended to harm the family and had simply needed a place to live. He seemed genuinely puzzled by their distress, as if he couldn't understand why they were upset about sharing their home with him. The Morrison family moved out of the house immediately after Harold's arrest, unable to feel safe in a place where their privacy had been so thoroughly violated. They struggled with the knowledge that for months they had been living under observation. their most private moments witnessed by a stranger who had been sleeping just feet away from their bedrooms. The case highlighted the vulnerability that exists even within the supposed safety of our own homes, and the importance of thoroughly inspecting any property before moving in. It also demonstrated how people living on the margins of society can find ways to survive that intrude on others in deeply disturbing ways. The midnight visitor had been real, but he wasn't a ghost or supernatural entity. He was something potentially more frightening, a living person who had been sharing their most intimate space without their knowledge or consent. Asterisk. 22-year-old Amanda Pierce thought she was living her best life. A recent college graduate with a degree in marketing, she had landed her dream job at a trendy advertising agency in downtown Seattle. She had her own apartment, a growing social media following, and what seemed like endless possibilities ahead of her. Amanda was the type of young woman who embraced the digital age, sharing her life openly on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Her social media presence was carefully curated, but appeared authentic. She posted photos of her morning coffee, her work outfits, her weekend adventures, and her cozy apartment. Her followers loved her content, and she had built a community of nearly 50,000 people who felt like they knew her personally. Amanda enjoyed the connection and validation that social media provided, never suspecting that her openness was making her a target. The first signs of trouble were so subtle that Amanda almost missed them entirely. She began receiving direct messages from an account with very few followers and no profile picture. The messages started out seeming harmless, compliments on her photos and questions about her day. The sender, who went by the username Watcher in the Night, seemed to know details about her life that went beyond what she had posted online. At first, Amanda was flattered by the attention and responded politely to the messages. The sender seemed intelligent and articulate, and their conversations gradually became more personal. Watcher in the Night claimed to be a fan who lived in the same city and shared many of Amanda's interests. They discussed books, movies, and restaurants, and Amanda began to look forward to their daily conversations. But as weeks passed, the messages became increasingly intense and personal. Watcher in the Night began referencing specific details about Amanda's daily routine that she had never posted online. They knew what time she left for work, what route she took to the gym, and even what she had eaten for lunch on days when she hadn't posted food photos. When Amanda asked how they knew such specific information, Watcher in the Night claimed to have mutual friends who had mentioned these details. The situation escalated when Amanda began receiving gifts at her workplace. Beautiful flowers would arrive, with notes signed Watcher in the Night, followed by expensive coffee from her favorite cafe, and eventually designer items that perfectly matched her style. When Amanda tried to refuse the gifts or return them, the delivery services said they had been paid for in cash and couldn't be returned. Amanda's discomfort turned to fear when she realized that Watcher in the Night somehow knew her home address, work schedule, and personal routines in detail that suggested surveillance rather than casual observation. When she changed her morning coffee shop, Watcher in the Night mentioned her new choice within hours. When she took a different route to work, they commented on landmarks she would have passed. The messages became increasingly possessive and demanding. Watcher in the Night began expressing anger when Amanda didn't respond quickly enough and jealousy when she posted photos with friends or colleagues. They started making references to owning her and protecting her from people who didn't deserve her attention. The tone shifted from admiration to obsession, and Amanda realized she was dealing with someone who had lost touch with reality. When Amanda tried to block Watcher in the Night, they simply created new accounts and continued messaging her. They seemed to have an unlimited ability to find ways to contact her, and their messages became increasingly threatening. They claimed to know where she lived, where she worked, and who her friends and family were. They began making veiled threats. about what would happen if she didn't respond or if she tried to ignore them. Amanda finally contacted the police when she discovered that someone had been taking photographs of her without her knowledge. Watcher in the Night sent her pictures of herself walking to work, sitting in her favorite cafe, and even entering her apartment building. The images were taken from various angles and distances, suggesting that her stalker had been following her. For weeks or possibly months, the investigation into Amanda's stalker was complicated by the digital nature of the harassment and the stalker's apparent technical sophistication. Police cybercrime specialists worked to trace the accounts back to their source, but Watcher in the Night had used sophisticated methods to hide their identity, including VPNs, burner phones, and fake email addresses. The breakthrough came when investigators analyzed the metadata from the photographs that had been sent to Amanda. Hidden in the digital files were GPS coordinates and timestamp information that helped them narrow down the stalker's location and movement patterns. By cross-referencing this data with security camera footage from various locations around the city, they were able to identify their suspect. Robert Chun, a 34-year-old software developer, was arrested at his apartment, where police found elaborate surveillance equipment and walls covered with photographs of Amanda taken without her consent. Robert had been following Amanda for over 6 months, documenting her every movement and building an obsessive fantasy relationship with her. Robert's apartment revealed the depth of his obsession with Amanda. He had printed and framed her social media photos, created detailed charts of her daily routines, and even purchased clothing and items similar to one she owned. He had been living in a fantasy where Amanda was his girlfriend, and her social media posts were personal communications directed specifically at him. During questioning, Robert revealed that he had been using Amanda's social media posts to learn about her preferences, schedule, and personality. He had studied her content obsessively, memorizing details and using them to create the illusion that they had a personal connection. He genuinely believed that their online conversations had constituted a real relationship and was confused by Amanda's distress over his behavior. The investigation also revealed that Robert had been stalking other women through social media, though none to the extent that he had pursued Amanda. He had a pattern of becoming obsessed with women who shared details of their lives online and had a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit social media platforms to gather personal information about his targets. Robert Chun was charged with stalking, harassment, and invasion of privacy. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and 5 years of probation, with restrictions on his internet usage and requirements for psychological counseling. A restraining order was issued to protect Amanda from any future contact. Amanda's experience had a lasting impact on her relationship with social media and her sense of personal safety. She significantly reduced her online presence, made her accounts private, and became much more cautious about sharing personal information. She also became an advocate for digital privacy and safety, speaking publicly about the dangers of oversharing on social media platforms. The case highlighted the new forms of stalking and harassment that have emerged in the digital age, where social media platforms can provide stalkers with unprecedented access to information about their targets. It demonstrated the importance of privacy settings, careful consideration of what information to share online, and the need for stronger protections against digital harassment. Watcher in the Night had been watching more than Amanda could have ever imagined, turning her openness and authenticity into weapons against her. The case served as a stark reminder that in the age of social media, privacy is not just a preference, but a necessity for personal safety. When Elena Rodriguez hired Jake Morrison to renovate her kitchen, she thought she had found the perfect contractor. Jake was recommended by her neighbor, had excellent online reviews, and offered competitive prices for high-quality work. He was polite, professional, and seemed genuinely committed to making her renovation dreams come true. What Elena didn't know was that Jake had chosen her as his next victim long before she ever contacted him about the renovation. Elena was a 34-year-old single mother who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. She had recently inherited her grandmother's house and was excited to update the outdated kitchen into a modern space where she could cook for her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia. The renovation represented a fresh start for Elena, who had been through a difficult divorce and was finally feeling financially stable, enough to invest in her home. Jake Morrison presented himself as an experienced contractor who specialized in kitchen renovations. His business cards were professional, his truck was well maintained, and he carried what appeared to be proper licensing and insurance documentation. He spent considerable time discussing Elena's vision for the space, offering suggestions and modifications that seemed thoughtful and practical. What Elena didn't realize was that Jake was not actually a licensed contractor, and the positive reviews she had found online were fake, created by Jake himself using multiple accounts. His real expertise was not in construction, but in manipulation, surveillance, and violence. He had been targeting single women homeowners for over 2 years, using home renovation projects as a way to gain access to their homes and their lives. Jake's method was sophisticated and patient. He would identify potential victims through real estate transactions, divorce records, and social media posts about home improvement projects. He targeted women who lived alone or with small children, women who would be vulnerable and isolated during the extended period that major renovations required. Once Jake secured a renovation contract, he would begin the process of isolating his victims from their support networks. He would find reasons why the work was taking longer than expected, why it was necessary for him to have keys to the house, and why it would be better if the homeowner didn't have other contractors or family members visiting during the construction process. Elena began to notice concerning changes in Jake's behavior about 3 weeks into the renovation. He started arriving earlier than scheduled and staying later than necessary. He asked personal questions about her work schedule, her daughter's school, and her social life. When Elena mentioned that her ex-husband would be picking up Sophia for the weekend, Jake seemed unusually interested in the details of their custody arrangement. Jake also began creating problems that required Elena to spend money she hadn't budgeted for the renovation. He claimed to discover structural issues that needed immediate attention, electrical problems that required expensive upgrades, and plumbing complications that would extend the timeline significantly. Each problem seemed to require Elena to dip further into her savings and become more dependent on Jake's expertise. The red flags became more obvious when Elena noticed that Jake had been going through her personal belongings when she wasn't home. Items in her bedroom had been moved, her mail had been disturbed, and she found muddy footprints in areas of the house where Jake had no legitimate reason to be working. When she confronted him about these intrusions, Jake became defensive and claimed he was only trying to assess the full scope of the renovation project. Elena's discomfort reached a breaking point when she discovered that Jake had installed a small camera in her bedroom, hidden among the equipment for the renovation. When she realized she was being watched and recorded in her most private moments, Elena immediately contacted the police and demanded that Jake leave her property immediately. Investigation into Jake Morrison revealed a disturbing pattern of exploitation and abuse targeting vulnerable women. Police discovered that Jake had victimized at least 8 other women over the previous 2 years, using nearly identical tactics to gain access to their homes and their lives. In several cases, the abuse had escalated to physical and sexual violence. Jake's apartment contained surveillance equipment, explicit videos recorded without consent, and detailed files on numerous women who had hired him for home improvement projects. He had been documenting their routines, their relationships, and their vulnerabilities, using this information to manipulate and control them more effectively. The investigation also revealed that Jake had been selling the private videos he had recorded to online platforms that specialized in non-consensual intimate content. He had been profiting from his violations of these women's privacy, while simultaneously using their vulnerability to commit additional crimes against them. Several of Jake's previous victims came forward during the investigation, sharing similar stories of manipulation, surveillance, and abuse. Many had been too afraid or embarrassed to report their experiences initially, but Elena's courage in contacting police encouraged them to seek justice for their own victimization. Jake Morrison was charged with multiple felonies including burglary, invasion of privacy, fraud, and sexual assault. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with requirements for psychological treatment and lifetime registration as a sex offender. He was also ordered to pay restitution to his victims for the financial and emotional damage he had caused. Elena Rodriguez struggled to rebuild her sense of safety and security after discovering the extent to which her privacy had been violated. She was forced to move out of her grandmother's house temporarily while it was thoroughly searched for additional surveillance equipment, and she underwent months of counseling to process the trauma of being watched and recorded without her knowledge. Case prompted changes in how contractors are verified and licensed in Elena's community, with new requirements for background checks and better protection for consumers hiring home improvement services. It also highlighted the vulnerability that exists when people invite strangers into their homes for extended periods and the importance of verifying credentials thoroughly before hiring any contractor. The helpful handyman had been anything but helpful, using his access to homes and his apparent expertise to exploit and abuse the women who trusted him. Elena's willingness to speak up about her experience not only saved her from further victimization, but also brought justice for other women who had suffered similar abuse. Asterisk. 15-year-old Maya Chun thought she had found her soulmate online. In the depths of teenage loneliness and the struggle to fit in at her new high school, Maya had connected with someone who seemed to understand her completely. The person she knew as Alex_22 was charming, intelligent, and appeared to share all of her interests in art, music, and literature. Their online relationship had been developing for 3 months when Alex suggested they meet in person. Maya was a bright but introverted teenager who had always been more comfortable expressing herself through writing and art than through face-to-face conversation. When her family moved to a new city at the beginning of her sophomore year, Maya struggled to make friends at her new school. She felt like an outsider, and her academic success made her a target for bullying from classmates who saw her as pretentious or standoff. In her isolation, Maya turned to online communities where she could discuss her interests without the social pressures and judgments she faced at school. It was in one of these forums, dedicated to creative writing, that she first encountered Alex_22. Their initial conversation centered around literature and poetry, but gradually became more personal as they discovered their apparent compatibility. Alex presented himself as a 22-year-old college student studying creative writing at a university in a nearby state. He claimed to understand Maya's struggles with fitting in and shared stories about his own experiences with social isolation during high school. Their conversations became increasingly intimate, with Alex positioning himself as the only person who truly understood and appreciated Maya for who she really was. What Maya didn't know was that Alex_22 was actually Dennis Hoffman, a 47-year-old man with a history of targeting vulnerable teenagers online. Dennis had spent years perfecting his ability to identify and manipulate young people who were struggling with social isolation, family problems, or mental health issues. He was skilled at creating false identities and maintaining long-term deceptive relationships with multiple victims simultaneously. Dennis had studied Maya's online presence carefully before making contact with her. He knew about her family's recent move, her struggles at school, and her interests in creative pursuits. He had crafted his Alex persona specifically to appeal to Maya's personality and interests, creating the illusion of a perfect match that was actually the result of calculated manipulation. Over the 3 months of their online relationship, Dennis had gradually isolated Maya from her family and the few friends she had managed to make at her new school. He convinced her that she was too mature and intelligent for her classmates, and that her parents wouldn't understand the deep connection they shared. He encouraged her to keep their relationship secret, claiming that adults would try to interfere because they were jealous of their special bond. Dennis also began introducing sexual elements into their conversations, gradually pushing boundaries and normalizing inappropriate discussions. He sent Maya gifts and wrote her poetry, creating the feeling that their relationship was romantic and special rather than exploitative and illegal. He used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to make Maya feel like she was an equal partner in an adult relationship. When Dennis finally suggested that they meet in person, Maya was excited but nervous. Alex had explained that he would be visiting her city for a writing conference and suggested they could meet at a local coffee shop. Maya agreed, never suspecting that she was being lured into a trap that had been months in the making. Maya told her parents she was going to study at the library with a friend from school, then took public transportation to meet Alex at the agreed location. When she arrived at the coffee shop, she was confused because the person waiting for her looked nothing like the photos Alex had sent. Dennis quickly explained that he had used older photos and had gained weight since college, but Maya's instincts told her something was very wrong. Dennis tried to convince Maya to leave the coffee shop with him, claiming that the location was too crowded for them to have a private conversation. When Maya refused and attempted to leave, Dennis became more insistent and eventually grabbed her arm, trying to force her to come with him. Maya's screams attracted the attention of other customers, and Dennis fled when someone threatened to call the police. Maya was shaken, but physically unharmed by the encounter. When she returned home and told her parents what had happened, they immediately contacted law enforcement. The investigation into Dennis Hoffman revealed the extent of his predatory behavior and the sophisticated methods he used to target vulnerable teenagers. Police found that Dennis had been maintaining relationships with dozens of teenage victims across multiple states, using various false identities and carefully crafted personas. His computer contained extensive files on each victim, including detailed psychological profiles, conversation logs, and plans for eventual meetings. Some of these relationships had been ongoing for years without the victims realizing they were being manipulated. The investigation also revealed that Dennis had successfully lured other teenagers to meet him in person, and that Maya had been fortunate to escape before becoming a victim of physical and sexual abuse. Several other families came forward with similar stories after Dennis's arrest, and investigators were able to identify numerous victims who had been exploited over several years. Dennis Hoffman was charged with attempted kidnapping, solicitation of a minor, and multiple counts of exploitation of children. Additional charges were filed in other states where he had victimized teenagers, and he ultimately received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. He was also required to register as a sex offender and was banned from using the internet without supervision. Maya struggled with feelings of guilt and embarrassment after discovering how thoroughly she had been manipulated. She required counseling to process the betrayal and to understand that she had been the victim of a skilled predator who had targeted her specifically because of her vulnerability. Her family also underwent therapy to address the trauma and to learn how to better protect Maya and support her recovery. The case prompted Maya's school district to implement new programs about online safety and digital literacy, helping students understand the risks of forming relationships with strangers online and the tactics that predators use to manipulate young people. Maya eventually became an advocate for online safety, sharing her story to help other teenagers recognize and avoid similar situations. Alex_22 had never been the soulmate Maya thought she had found. Instead, he had been a carefully constructed lie designed to exploit her loneliness and vulnerability. Maya's courage in speaking up about her experience and her quick thinking during the attempted abduction likely saved her from serious harm and helped prevent Dennis from claiming additional victims. The case served as a reminder that online relationships, particularly those involving significant age differences or secretive elements, require careful scrutiny, and that the personas people present online may bear no resemblance to their true identities or intentions. Detective Sarah Martinez had been investigating cold cases for 15 years when she received the letter that would change everything. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in a standard white envelope with no return address, postmarked from a city 300 miles away. Inside was a handwritten confession that detailed 3 murders that had never been solved, written by someone claiming to be responsible for crimes that had haunted Sarah's department for over a decade. The letter was written in careful block print, the kind used by someone trying to disguise their handwriting. It began simply, "Detective Martinez, I know you've been looking for me for a long time. I'm ready to tell you everything." What followed was a detailed account of 3 murders that had occurred between 2008 and 2012, each described with a level of detail that only the killer could have known. The first case involved Margaret Chun, a 45-year-old librarian who had been found murdered in her apartment in 2008. The second was Robert Williams, a 38-year-old accountant whose body had been discovered in a remote park in 2010. The third victim was Jennifer Lopez, a 29-year-old teacher who had vanished in 2012 and whose remains had never been found. All 3 cases had been thoroughly investigated, but no suspects had ever been identified, and no connections between the victims had been established. What made the letter particularly compelling was not just the accurate details about the crime scenes, but information that had never been released to the public. The author knew about evidence that had been held back specifically to verify any future confessions. They knew about Margaret's hidden jewelry box, about the unusual way Robert's body had been positioned, and about Jennifer's distinctive bracelet that had been missing from her belongings. The letter continued with a surprising revelation. "I'm dying. Detective Martinez. Cancer has given me maybe 6 months to live, and I can't take these secrets with me to the grave. I need you to know what really happened to these people, and I need their families to have answers." Sarah had seen false confessions before, usually from people seeking attention or trying to take credit for notorious crimes, but this letter was different. The details were too accurate, too specific, and too closely guarded to be the product of someone who wasn't directly involved. Moreover, the writer seemed to have no interest in fame or notoriety, requesting that their identity not be revealed until after their death. The investigation into the letter led Sarah to a small town 3 hours away, where she discovered that the confession had been sent by Thomas Miller, a 67-year-old retired mechanic who was indeed dying of terminal cancer. Thomas had no criminal record, no connection to any of the victims, and no obvious motive for the murders. To all outward appearances, he was a quiet, unremarkable man who had lived an ordinary life. When Sarah interviewed Thomas at his home, she found a man who seemed relieved to finally be telling his story. He was weak from chemotherapy treatments, but his memory of the murders was crystal clear. He walked Sarah through each crime in detail, explaining how he had selected his victims, how he had gained access to them, and how he had avoided detection. For so many years, Thomas's motivation for the murders was as shocking as the crimes themselves. He explained that he had been struggling with depression and feelings of powerlessness after his wife had left him and he had lost his job at the garage where he had worked for 20 years. The murders had given him a sense of control and importance that he had been unable to find anywhere else in his life. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Thomas's confession was his explanation for why he had chosen these particular victims. He had selected people who lived alone, had minimal social connections, and whose disappearances wouldn't be immediately noticed. He had spent months studying each victim, learning their routines and identifying their vulnerabilities before striking. Margaret Chun had been chosen because she worked late hours at the library and lived alone in an apartment building where neighbors minded their own business. Thomas had posed as a maintenance worker to gain access to her apartment, then attacked her when she returned home from work. He had made her death look like a robbery, taking some jewelry and electronics. To support that theory, Robert Williams had been targeted because of his isolated lifestyle and his habit of jogging alone in remote areas. Thomas had followed him for weeks, learning his route and timing. On the night of the murder, Thomas had disabled Robert's car in the parking area near the trail, then offered him a ride home. Instead, he had driven Robert to a secluded location, where he killed him and disposed of the body. Jennifer Lopez had been the most challenging victim because she was younger and more socially connected than the others. Thomas had posed as a potential tenant interested in renting the basement apartment in Jennifer's duplex. When she let him inside to show him the space, he had attacked her. Her body had been buried in a remote wooded area that Thomas knew well. From his childhood, a location so isolated that it had never been searched. As Thomas detailed his crimes, Sarah was struck by his matter-of-fact tone and apparent lack of remorse. He described the murders as if they were mechanical problems he had solved, showing more emotion when discussing his cancer diagnosis than when talking about the lives he had taken. It was clear that Thomas viewed his victims as objects rather than human beings, and that their deaths had meant no more to him than discarding broken machinery. The confession also revealed why the murders had stopped after 2012. Thomas explained that he had met a woman named Carol and had begun a relationship with her. The companionship and sense of purpose that the relationship provided had satisfied his psychological needs in a way that made killing unnecessary. When Carol died of a heart attack in 2018, Thomas had considered resuming his killing, but his own health had begun to decline, making it impossible to carry out the physical demands of murder. Thomas's confession allowed Sarah to finally solve 3 cases that had haunted her department for years, but it also raised troubling questions about how many other victims there might have been. Thomas admitted that he had been practicing on animals for years before escalating to human victims, and that he had considered killing other people who had ultimately been spared by circumstance or luck. The investigation into Thomas's background revealed a pattern of escalating violence that had gone unnoticed for decades. As a teenager, he had been suspected of killing neighborhood pets, though charges were never filed. As an adult, he had been involved in several domestic violence incidents with previous girlfriends, though none had resulted in serious charges. The warning signs had been there, but no one had connected them or recognized the potential for escalation. Thomas Miller died 4 months after sending his confession letter, taking with him any additional secrets about his crimes. He was buried in a small ceremony attended only by a few distant relatives, with no mention of his dark legacy. The families of his victims were finally able to have closure, but the knowledge of what had really happened to their loved ones brought its own form of pain. Sarah Martinez retired from law enforcement 2 years after closing the Thomas Miller cases, feeling that she had accomplished what she had set out to do in her career. She had brought justice to victims and answers to families, but the experience had also shown her the depths of human cruelty and the ways that evil could hide in plain sight for decades. The case of Thomas Miller served as a reminder that some of the most dangerous predators are those who appear completely ordinary, who blend seamlessly into their communities while harboring the darkest of secrets. His final confession had provided closure for some families, but it had also revealed how many victims of violence never receive justice, and how many killers live out their lives without ever being held accountable for their crimes. As you settle in for sleep tonight, remember that while monsters like Thomas Miller exist, they are far outnumbered by the people who dedicate their lives to stopping them. Detectives like Sarah Martinez work tirelessly to bring justice to victims and peace to families, often carrying the weight of unsolved cases for years until the truth finally emerges. The darkness is real, but it is always opposed by those who choose to walk in the light, seeking truth and justice no matter how long it takes. Sweet dreams, and remember that even the coldest cases can eventually be solved when someone is brave enough to tell the truth. Thank you for listening to these disturbing but important stories. Like and subscribe if you found this content valuable. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Sleep well, knowing that justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of finding even the most carefully hidden secrets. 8-year-old Tommy Patterson was excited about his birthday party. His mother, Linda, had planned everything perfectly. Decorations in his favorite superhero theme, a chocolate cake with 8 candles, and invitations sent to all his classmates. The party was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in their backyard, and Tommy had been counting down the days for weeks. Linda Patterson was a devoted single mother who worked 2 jobs to provide for Tommy after her husband had abandoned them 3 years earlier. Despite their financial struggles, she was determined to give Tommy the kind of childhood birthday party she remembered from her own youth. She had saved money for months to afford the decorations, food, and small party favors for the children. Party started perfectly. 12 children from Tommy's 3rd grade class arrived with their parents, filling the small backyard with laughter and excitement. Linda had organized games, set up a small inflatable pool, and prepared sandwiches and snacks. For a few hours, everything seemed magical, and Tommy was radiantly happy surrounded by his friends. But as the afternoon progressed, something went terribly wrong. Parents began arriving to pick up their children, and Linda realized that one child, 7-year-old Emma Walsh, was nowhere to be found. Emma's mother, Carol, had dropped her off at the beginning of the party and was returning at the scheduled pickup time. But Emma seemed to have vanished. Initially, everyone assumed Emma was simply hiding somewhere in the house or yard. The remaining children and adults searched every room, every closet, and every possible hiding spot. They called her name repeatedly, checked under beds and behind furniture, and even looked in the garage and basement. But Emma was nowhere to be found. As minutes turned to hours, the festive atmosphere transformed into panic. Carol Walsh became hysterical, and Linda felt overwhelmed with guilt and responsibility. The police were called, and within an hour, the Patterson home was swarming with officers conducting a systematic search of the property and surrounding neighborhood. The investigation revealed disturbing details about what had happened during the party. Several children reported seeing a man they didn't recognize talking to Emma near the back fence of the yard. The man had been wearing a maintenance worker's uniform and had claimed to be fixing something in the neighbor's yard. When Emma approached the fence to see what he was doing, he had engaged her in conversation. What made the situation even more troubling was that none of the adults at the party had noticed this interaction. The parents had been focused on supervising the games and activities in the main area of the yard, while the conversation at the fence had occurred in a corner that was partially hidden by Linda's garden shed. Security camera footage from a neighboring house captured a partial view of a man in work clothes approaching the fence around the time Emma disappeared. The footage also showed the same man leaving the area about 20 minutes later, but the image quality was too poor to make a positive identification, and no vehicle was visible. The search for Emma expanded rapidly, involving hundreds of volunteers, search dogs, and helicopters. Amber alerts were issued, and Emma's photo was distributed throughout the region. But as days passed with no trace of the missing girl, hope began to fade, and the investigation shifted from a rescue operation to a criminal investigation. The case took a devastating turn. 1 week later, when Emma's body was discovered in a remote wooded area 15 miles from the Patterson home, she had been murdered, and the condition of her remains indicated that she had been held captive for several days before her death. The medical examiner determined that Emma had suffered horrific abuse before being killed. DNA evidence found on Emma's clothing led investigators to Marcus Webb, a 43-year-old man who worked for a landscaping company that had been doing maintenance work in the neighborhood. Webb had been using his legitimate work as a cover to study potential victims and identify opportunities for abduction. During questioning, Webb revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior. He had been attending children's birthday parties and community events for months, posing as a worker or delivery person to gain access to homes where children would be present. He would study the layout of properties, note which areas lacked adequate supervision, and identify children who might be easily lured away from safety. Webb's apartment contained surveillance equipment, photographs of numerous children taken without permission, and detailed notes about their routines and vulnerabilities. He had been planning Emma's abduction for weeks, having observed her playing in her own yard and walking to school. The birthday party had simply provided the perfect opportunity to act on his plan. The investigation also revealed that Webb had been responsible for at least 2 other child abductions in neighboring states over the previous 3 years. In each case, he had used his work as a landscaper to gain access to communities and study potential victims. The other children had never been found, and their cases had remained unsolved until Webb's arrest. Marcus Webb was sentenced to death for Emma's murder, with additional life sentences for the other abductions and murders he eventually confessed to committing. He showed no remorse for his crimes and even seemed to take pleasure in describing the suffering he had inflicted on his young victims. The Walsh family was destroyed by Emma's death. Carol Walsh never recovered from the guilt of having left her daughter at what should have been a safe, supervised party. She blamed herself for not staying at the party, for not being more cautious about where she allowed Emma to go, and for not being there to protect her daughter when she was needed most. Linda Patterson also struggled with overwhelming guilt, feeling responsible for Emma's abduction despite having done nothing wrong. The birthday party that was supposed to celebrate her son's happiness became associated with the worst tragedy imaginable. She and Tommy eventually moved to another state, unable to remain in a place that held such painful memories. The case prompted significant changes in how children's parties and community events were supervised. Parents became more vigilant about maintaining constant supervision of their children, and communities implemented stricter policies about who could have access to events where children were present. Tommy Patterson's 8th birthday party should have been a day of joy and celebration. Instead, it became the setting for a tragedy that shattered multiple families and reminded an entire community that predators could strike anywhere, even in the most innocent and joyful circumstances. The case served as a stark reminder that parents must remain vigilant even in situations that seem completely safe, and that evil can hide behind the most ordinary appearances. Emma Walsh's death was a tragedy that could have been prevented if just one adult had been watching the right place at the right time. When Riverside Elementary School needed a last-minute substitute teacher for Mrs. Johnson's 3rd grade class, they thought they were fortunate to find Daniel Brooks available on short notice. Daniel had excellent credentials, glowing references from previous positions, and a warm, engaging personality that immediately put both students and staff at ease. What no one knew was that Daniel Brooks was not his real name, and his credentials were completely fabricated. The man calling himself Daniel Brooks was actually Christopher Lane, a 38-year-old former teacher who had been fired from his previous position and banned from working with children due to inappropriate conduct. Christopher had spent months creating a false identity, complete with fake transcripts, references, and teaching certificates that appeared authentic, enough to pass casual screening. Christopher's method for infiltrating schools was sophisticated and patient. He would research districts that used substitute teachers frequently, particularly those in areas where background checks might be less thorough or where the need for substitutes was urgent enough that corners might be cut in the Hiring process. He had successfully worked in 4 different school districts over 2 years without his true identity being discovered. Asterisk on his first day at Riverside Elementary, Christopher immediately began studying the children in his temporary classroom, looking for students who might be vulnerable to manipulation. He was particularly drawn to 8-year-old Sarah Mitchell, a quiet girl who seemed to lack confidence and appeared hungry for adult attention and approval. Sarah was struggling academically and socially, having difficulty keeping up with her classmates and often feeling left out of playground activities. Her parents were going through a difficult divorce, and the stress at home was affecting her performance at school. Christopher recognized these vulnerabilities and began targeting Sarah for special attention. Christopher's grooming of Sarah was subtle and gradual. He praised her work excessively, gave her special privileges like helping him with classroom tasks, and created opportunities for private conversations during lunch and recess. He told Sarah that she was special and mature for her age and that he understood her in ways that other adults didn't. Over the course of several weeks, Christopher began isolating Sarah from her classmates and creating a sense of special relationship between them. He would keep her after class to help with organizing materials, give her small gifts that he claimed were rewards for good behavior, and gradually introduce inappropriate physical contact disguised as friendly gestures. The abuse escalated when Christopher began asking Sarah to stay after school for extra tutoring sessions. He convinced her parents that she needed additional help with her reading, and they were grateful for his apparent dedication to their daughter's education. During these private sessions, Christopher subjected Sarah to increasingly inappropriate behavior while manipulating her into keeping their interactions secret. Christopher told Sarah that their special relationship was something that other people wouldn't understand, and that she could get in trouble if she told anyone about their private talks and activities. He convinced her that she was mature enough to handle grown-up relationships and that their connection was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. The abuse might have continued indefinitely if not for the observational skills of the school janitor, Mr. Rodriguez, who noticed that Christopher's after-school sessions with Sarah seemed to last longer than necessary and that both teacher and student appeared uncomfortable when interrupted. Mr. Rodriguez also observed that Christopher was very careful about closing doors and blocking windows during his private sessions. Mr. Rodriguez's concerns prompted him to speak with the principal, who decided to investigate Christopher's background more thoroughly. When the school attempted to verify his credentials and references, they discovered that several of the institutions he claimed to have attended had no record of him, and the phone numbers for his references were disconnected or led to answering services. The investigation into Christopher Lane revealed the extent of his deception and the danger he posed to children. Police found that he had been using multiple false identities to gain access to schools across several states, and that Sarah was not his first victim. Evidence in his apartment included photographs of numerous children taken without permission, and detailed notes about their vulnerabilities and family situations. When confronted with the evidence, Christopher initially denied any wrongdoing, claiming that his relationships with students were purely educational and that any physical contact had been misinterpreted. However, as more victims came forward and additional evidence was discovered, he eventually confessed to abusing multiple children over several years. Sarah Mitchell required extensive therapy to recover from the trauma of Christopher's abuse. She struggled with feelings of guilt and confusion, having been manipulated into believing that she was a willing participant in an appropriate relationship. Her parents also underwent counseling to learn how to support their daughter's recovery and to cope with their own guilt over having trusted their child to someone who betrayed that trust so completely. Christopher Lane was sentenced to 25 years in prison on multiple charges including child abuse, fraud, and identity theft. The case prompted significant changes in how schools verify the credentials of substitute teachers, with new requirements for more thorough background checks and better systems for detecting false identities. The Riverside Elementary case also led to improved training for school staff on recognizing signs of inappropriate relationships between adults and children, and new policies requiring multiple adults to be present during any private interactions between teachers and students. The substitute teacher, who had seemed like a blessing to a school in need, had actually been a predator in disguise, using the trust that society places in educators to gain access to vulnerable children. Christopher Lane's case served as a reminder that schools must be vigilant about who they allow into positions of authority over children, and that even temporary employees require thorough screening and ongoing supervision. Sarah Mitchell's courage in eventually speaking about her experiences, combined with Mr. Rodriguez's willingness to voice his concerns, prevented Christopher from claiming additional victims and helped bring justice for the children he had already harmed. When Amazon driver Kevin Norris started his route through the suburban neighborhood of Westfield Heights, residents appreciated his friendly demeanor and reliable service. Kevin was always polite, often went out of his way to ensure packages were hidden from view, and seemed to genuinely care about providing excellent customer service. What residents didn't know was that Kevin was using his access to their homes and his knowledge of their routines for far more sinister purposes. Kevin Norris was a 32-year-old man who had been working as a delivery driver for various companies. For over 3 years, he had discovered that the job provided him with unparalleled access to people's homes, their schedules, and their personal information. While other drivers saw the work as simply transporting packages, Kevin saw it as an opportunity for surveillance and potential criminal activity. Kevin's method was sophisticated and patient. During his regular delivery routes, he would note which homes appeared to belong to people living alone, particularly women who seemed to have regular work schedules that left their homes empty during predictable hours. He paid attention to details, like single cars in driveways, mail addressed to only one person, and homes that appeared to lack security systems. More disturbing was Kevin's practice of photographing the interiors of homes when residents opened their doors to receive packages. He used the legitimate requirement to have packages signed for as an excuse to position himself where he could see inside homes and note valuable items, security vulnerabilities, and layout details that could be useful for future criminal activity. Kevin also began keeping copies of delivery information that included residents' full names, addresses, and phone numbers. He used this information to conduct online research about his potential targets, learning about their work schedules, social media activity, and personal relationships. This research helped him identify the most vulnerable targets and the best times to strike. His first victim was Jennifer Walsh, a 29-year-old nurse who worked night shifts at the local hospital. Kevin had been delivering packages to Jennifer's apartment for several months and had learned that she typically slept during the day after working overnight shifts. He knew which days she worked, when she was likely to be alone, and how to access her apartment building. Kevin used his uniform and official vehicle to gain entry to Jennifer's building, claiming to have a package that required a signature. Once inside, he used lock-picking tools he had taught himself to use to enter Jennifer's apartment while she slept. He initially took only small items that wouldn't be immediately missed, but his crimes quickly escalated to more serious violations. Jennifer woke during one of Kevin's intrusions to find him standing in her bedroom, holding items from her dresser. When she screamed and tried to call for help, Kevin attacked her, using his physical strength to overpower her and prevent her from escaping or calling police. The assault was brutal and traumatic, leaving Jennifer with both physical injuries and severe psychological trauma. After attacking Jennifer, Kevin continued his pattern of targeting women who lived alone, using his position as a delivery driver to study their routines and vulnerabilities. He broke into at least 6 homes over the following months, stealing valuables and assaulting residents who had the misfortune to be present during his intrusions. Kevin's crimes were eventually discovered when one of his victims, Maria Santos, managed to photograph his license plate as he fled from her home after an attempted assault. Maria had been awakened by sounds of someone moving through her house and had hidden in her closet while calling 911. When Kevin realized that someone was home, he fled quickly, but not before Maria was able to get a partial view of his delivery truck. The investigation into Kevin Norris revealed the extent of his criminal activity and the systematic way he had been using his job to target victims. Police found detailed files in his apartment containing information about dozens of women, including their addresses, work schedules, and personal details gathered during his delivery routes. Kevin's vehicle and storage unit contained stolen items from numerous homes, evidence of his break-ins, and surveillance equipment he had been using to monitor potential victims. He had been operating essentially as a professional burglar and predator, using his legitimate employment as a cover for extensive criminal activity. During questioning, Kevin showed no remorse for his crimes and seemed proud of his ability to use his position to access victims. He described his activities as if they were a game, with residents as unwitting participants in his criminal enterprise. His lack of empathy and his view of his victims as objects rather than human beings was deeply disturbing to investigators. Kevin Norris was sentenced to 30 years in prison on charges including breaking and entering, theft, assault, and multiple counts of stalking. The case prompted significant changes in how delivery companies screen their employees and monitor their activities, with new requirements for background checks and GPS tracking of vehicles. The case also led to increased awareness among residents about the need to be cautious about how much personal information they share with delivery drivers and other service workers who have regular access to their homes. Many people began using security cameras and being more careful about package delivery procedures. Jennifer Walsh required months of therapy to recover from her assault and struggled with feelings of violation that went beyond the physical attack. The knowledge that someone had been watching her and studying her routines for months before attacking her created a sense of paranoia that took years to overcome. The delivery driver, who had seemed so helpful and trustworthy, had been using his position to prey on the very people he was supposed to be serving. Kevin Norris's case served as a reminder that predators can hide behind any uniform or position of trust, and that residents must remain vigilant even when dealing with people who appear to be providing legitimate services. For 3 years, Harold Chun had been driving bus route 47 for the Lincoln County School District, transporting children from the rural farming community of Cedar Ridge to and from school each day. Harold was known for his patience with the children, his careful driving, and his willingness to help with problems that arose during the daily commute. Parents trusted him with their most precious possessions, never suspecting that Harold was using his position to prey on the children in his care. Harold Chun was a 45-year-old man who had specifically sought employment as a school bus driver. Because of the access it provided to children, he had studied the application process carefully, ensuring that his background check would be clean and that his references would portray him as someone suitable for working with children. What the school district didn't know was that Harold had been careful never to get caught in his previous inappropriate behavior with minors. Harold's method of selecting victims was methodical and patient. He studied the children on his bus route, learning their personalities, their family situations, and their vulnerabilities. He was particularly drawn to children who seemed lonely, who came from troubled homes, or who appeared to crave adult attention and approval. His first target was 10-year-old Amy Rodriguez, a 4th grader who was often the last child to be picked up in the morning and the first to be dropped off in the afternoon. Amy's parents both worked early shifts and weren't home when she got on or off the bus, leaving her unsupervised during the crucial transition times that Harold needed for his criminal activity. Harold began grooming Amy by giving her special attention and privileges on the bus. He allowed her to sit in the front seat, gave her small gifts like candy and toys, and engaged her in conversations about her interests and problems. He positioned himself as a caring adult who understood her better than her busy parents did. Gradually, Harold began creating opportunities for private interaction with Amy. He would claim that he needed to make a quick stop before taking her home, or that there was a problem with the bus that required her to wait while other children were dropped off. During these private moments, Harold began subjecting Amy to inappropriate behavior that escalated over several months. Harold's abuse of Amy might have continued indefinitely, if not for the observational skills of another student on the bus. 12-year-old Marcus Thompson noticed that Amy seemed upset and withdrawn after her private conversations with Harold, and that she appeared frightened when Harold spoke to her privately. Marcus also observed that Harold's mechanical problems and emergency stops seemed to occur only when Amy was the last child on the bus, and that these incidents were becoming more frequent. When Marcus shared his concerns with his older sister, she encouraged him to tell their parents, who immediately contacted the school district and local police. The investigation into Harold Chun revealed a disturbing pattern of abuse that had been occurring for over a year. Police discovered that Harold had been systematically targeting multiple children on his route, using his position of authority and the isolated environment of the school bus to commit crimes against vulnerable students. Harold's home contained evidence of his criminal activity, including photographs of children taken without permission and detailed notes about their schedules and family situations. He had been studying not just the children on his bus route, but children throughout the school district, apparently planning to expand his criminal activity. During questioning, Harold admitted to abusing several children over the 3 years he had been working for the school district. He showed no remorse for his actions and seemed to view his position as a school bus driver as a perfect hunting ground for potential victims. His casual attitude toward the suffering he had caused was deeply disturbing to investigators. The revelation of Harold's crime sent shockwaves through the Cedar Ridge community. Parents who had trusted him with their children's safety felt betrayed and violated. Many children required counseling to deal with the trauma of learning that someone they had trusted had been hurting their classmates and potentially themselves. Amy Rodriguez required extensive therapy to recover from the abuse she had suffered. Her parents struggled with guilt over not recognizing the signs of what was happening and blamed themselves for not being more involved in their daughter's daily transportation to and from school. Harold Chun was sentenced to 25 years in prison on multiple charges related to child abuse and exploitation. The case prompted significant changes in how school districts screen and monitor their bus drivers, with new requirements for more thorough background checks, regular training on appropriate behavior with students, and better systems for reporting and investigating concerns. The Lincoln County School District also implemented new policies requiring multiple adults to be present during any private interactions between drivers and students, and improved training for students on recognizing and reporting inappropriate behavior by adults in positions of authority. Marcus Thompson's courage in speaking up about his concerns likely prevented additional children from being victimized, and demonstrated the importance of teaching children to trust their instincts when something seems wrong. His willingness to voice his observations saved other children from the trauma that Amy and Harold's other victims had endured. The school bus driver who had seemed so caring and responsible had been using his position to commit crimes against the children he was supposed to protect. Harold Chun's case served as a reminder that predators actively seek positions that provide access to children, and that communities must remain vigilant about protecting children, even in situations that seem safe and supervised. Detective Maria Santos thought she had seen everything during her 20-year career in law enforcement. She had investigated murders, kidnappings, domestic violence cases, and crimes that had tested her faith in humanity. But nothing had prepared her for the case that would end her career and change her understanding of just how far evil could reach into the most trusted institutions of society. It began with a phone call from Dr. Patricia Moore, a child psychologist who had been working with several young patients who had exhibited similar behavioral changes and reported similar experiences. Dr. Moore explained that over the past 6 months, she had treated 5 different children, all between the ages of 7 and 10, who had been displaying symptoms of trauma and had eventually disclosed experiences of abuse. What made these cases unusual was not just the number of children involved, but the fact that they all described being abused by different adults in positions of authority within their community. The children came from different families, attended different schools, and lived in different neighborhoods, but their stories contained disturbing similarities that suggested a coordinated pattern of abuse. Detective Santos met with Dr. Moore to review the children's statements and medical reports. What she learned made her realize that she was looking at something far more complex and sinister than individual cases of abuse. The children described being taken to a house where multiple adults were present, where they were photographed and filmed, and where they were told that their parents had given permission for what was happening to them. The investigation that followed revealed a coordinated network of child predators who had been operating in plain sight for several years. The network included a school principal, 2 teachers, a youth pastor, a pediatric nurse, and several other community members who had used their positions of trust to identify vulnerable children and recruit them for abuse. The predators had been sophisticated in their methods, using their professional relationships with families to gain access to children, and their knowledge of child psychology to manipulate their victims. They had created an elaborate system of sharing information about potential victims and coordinating their abuse to avoid detection while maximizing their access to children. Dr. James Harrison, the elementary school principal, had been the leader of the network. He used his access to student records and his relationships with families to identify children who might be vulnerable to manipulation. He looked for children from single-parent homes, families going through financial stress, or children who seemed to lack strong support systems. Once potential victims were identified, other members of the network would be introduced into the children's lives through apparently legitimate channels. A teacher would offer after-school tutoring, a nurse would provide special medical attention, or a youth pastor would invite children to special programs. These relationships would be gradually sexualized through careful grooming and manipulation. Network had been operating for at least 5 years, during which time they had abused dozens of children while maintaining their respected positions in the community. They had been careful to select victims who were unlikely to be believed if they spoke about their experiences, and they had used sophisticated methods to ensure that their criminal activity remained hidden. The investigation into the network required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and took over a year to complete. Detectives had to interview hundreds of children and families, review thousands of documents, and carefully build cases against each member of the network while protecting the privacy and well-being of the victims. One by one, the members of the network were arrested and charged with multiple felonies related to child abuse, exploitation, and conspiracy. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including photographs and videos they had created, detailed records of their activities, and testimony from numerous victims who had found the courage to speak about their experiences. Dr. James Harrison was sentenced to life in prison without parole, while other members of the network received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. The case resulted in the largest child abuse prosecution in the state's history and led to significant changes in how institutions screen employees who work with children. The revelation of the network's activities devastated the community that had trusted these individuals with their children's safety and well-being. Parents struggled with guilt over having placed their children in situations where they were vulnerable to abuse. and many families required counseling to cope with the betrayal of trust. Detective Santos retired from law enforcement shortly after the network case was concluded, feeling that she had accomplished the most important work of her career, but also recognizing that the emotional toll of the investigation had left her unable to continue. She became an advocate for child protection and helped develop new training programs for law enforcement officers who investigate crimes against children. The case of the child abuse network served as a stark reminder that predators often seek positions of authority and trust, specifically because these positions provide access to potential victims. It demonstrated the importance of robust background checking, ongoing monitoring of adults who work with children, and creating environments where children feel safe reporting inappropriate behavior. Most importantly, the case showed that children's reports of abuse must always be taken seriously, regardless of how implausible they might seem or how respected the accused adult might be in the community. The courage of the 5 children who spoke to Dr. Moore about their experiences led to the exposure of a network that might otherwise have continued operating for years. As you prepare for sleep tonight, remember that while stories like this are deeply disturbing, they also demonstrate the power of speaking up and seeking justice. The children who found the courage to tell their stories, the psychologist who recognized the patterns, and the detective who pursued the truth all played crucial roles in stopping these predators and protecting other children from harm. The darkness is real, but it is always opposed by those who choose to stand up for the innocent and vulnerable. Sweet dreams, and remember that justice, though sometimes slow, has a way of exposing even the most carefully hidden evil. Thank you for listening to these 20 disturbing but important true crime stories. Like and subscribe if you found this content valuable, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Sleep well, knowing that even in the darkest stories, there are always those who fight for truth and justice. St. Mary's Hospital had always prided itself on providing exceptional patient care, particularly in its intensive care unit where the most vulnerable patients received around-the-clock attention. When Catherine Mills joined the night shift nursing staff, her colleagues were impressed by her dedication and her apparent ability to handle even the most challenging situations with calm professionalism. What they didn't know was that Catherine was deliberately creating many of those challenging situations herself. Catherine Mills was a 34-year-old registered nurse who had been working in healthcare for over 8 years. She had excellent credentials, glowing references from previous positions, and a reputation for being the kind of nurse who would go above and beyond for her patients. But beneath her compassionate facade, Catherine harbored a dark secret that would ultimately cost multiple patients their lives. Catherine suffered from a psychological condition known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which compelled her to harm patients under her care in order to position herself as their heroic rescuer. She derived psychological satisfaction from the crisis situations she created and the praise she received for her apparent skill in handling medical emergencies. Catherine's method was to administer unauthorized medications or substances to patients that would cause them to go into cardiac arrest or respiratory distress. She would then be the first to respond to the emergency, often successfully resuscitating patients and earning recognition for her quick thinking and medical expertise. To her colleagues, she appeared to be an exceptional nurse who had an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. Her first victim was George Patterson, an elderly man recovering from routine surgery who had been expected to make a full recovery. During Catherine's night shift, George suddenly went into cardiac arrest for no apparent medical reason. Catherine was the nurse who discovered his distress and led the resuscitation effort that saved his life. The incident was attributed to complications from his surgery, and Catherine was praised for her quick response. Over the following months, Catherine's patients experienced an unusually high number of unexplained medical emergencies during her shifts. Patients who had been stable would suddenly develop life-threatening complications that required immediate intervention. Catherine always seemed to be nearby when these emergencies occurred, and she consistently received praise for her ability to handle crisis situations. The pattern might have continued indefinitely, if not for the observational skills of Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a resident who noticed that Catherine's patients seemed to experience emergencies at a disproportionate rate compared to other nurses. Patients. Dr. Martinez also observed that these emergencies often occurred when Catherine was the only nurse in the immediate area, and that they followed no predictable medical pattern. Dr. Martinez began discreetly tracking the timing and circumstances of medical emergencies in the ICU, and what she discovered was deeply disturbing. Patients under Catherine's care were nearly 3 times more likely to experience unexplained cardiac events than patients under the care of other nurses, and these events occurred almost exclusively during night shifts when supervision was minimal. When Dr. Martinez brought her concerns to the hospital administration, an investigation was launched that would expose the horrifying truth about Catherine's activities. Hidden cameras were installed in the ICU, and Catherine's access to medications was secretly monitored to track any unauthorized usage. The surveillance revealed Catherine in the act of injecting potassium chloride into a patient's foreline, substance that would cause immediate cardiac arrest if administered in sufficient quantities. The patient, a woman recovering from routine gallbladder surgery, went into cardiac arrest within minutes of Catherine's injection. Catherine then led the successful resuscitation effort, saving the life she had just endangered. The investigation revealed that Catherine had been responsible for at least 12 unexplained cardiac events over 8 months, and that she had successfully murdered 3 patients whose resuscitation efforts had failed. She had been using her medical knowledge and access to medications to systematically harm patients while positioning herself as their savior. During questioning, Catherine initially denied any wrongdoing, claiming that she was being unfairly targeted because of jealousy over her clinical skills. However, when confronted with video evidence of her injecting unauthorized substances into patients' forelines, she eventually confessed to her crimes. Catherine's confession revealed the psychological motivation behind her actions. She described feeling powerless and insignificant in her daily life, and explained that the praise and recognition she received for handling medical emergencies made her feel important and valued. The act of creating and then resolving crisis situations gave her a sense of control and purpose that she couldn't find elsewhere. The revelation of Catherine's crimes sent shockwaves through St. Mary's Hospital and the broader medical community. Patients and families who had trusted her with their loved ones' lives felt betrayed and violated. Several families whose relatives had died during Catherine's care demanded investigations into whether their loved ones had been murdered. Catherine Mills was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 9 counts of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, making her one of the most prolific healthcare serial killers in the States. History. The case prompted significant changes in how hospitals monitor medication usage and staff behavior, particularly during night shifts when supervision is minimal. The families of Catherine's victims struggled to understand how someone who had taken an oath to do no harm could systematically harm and kill the patients she was supposed to protect. The betrayal was particularly devastating because many families had actually thanked Catherine for her efforts to save their loved ones, never knowing that she had been responsible for putting them in danger in the first place. St. Mary's Hospital implemented new protocols requiring multiple staff members to be present during medication administration and installed comprehensive surveillance systems throughout patient care areas. The hospital also established new training programs to help staff recognize signs of suspicious behavior among colleagues. The case served as a stark reminder that predators can hide behind any profession, even those that are dedicated to healing and caring for others. Catherine Mills had used her position of trust and her medical knowledge to harm the very people she was supposed to protect, demonstrating that vigilance is required even in healthcare settings where patients are at their most vulnerable. Camp. Wildwood had been providing outdoor adventures and character-building experiences for children and teenagers for over 30 years. Located in the mountains of Colorado, the camp attracted young people from across the country who were seeking adventure, friendship, and personal growth during their summer vacations. When Mark Thompson joined the counseling staff, he seemed like the perfect addition to their team of dedicated youth workers. Mark Thompson was a 28-year-old man who presented himself as someone passionate about working with young people and helping them develop confidence and outdoor skills. He had impressive credentials in wilderness education, excellent references from previous camps, and an engaging personality that immediately connected with both children and their parents. What no one knew was that Mark had specifically sought employment at summer camps because of the access they provided to vulnerable children in isolated settings. Mark's background was carefully constructed to hide his true intentions. He had spent years developing the skills and credentials that would make him an attractive candidate for youth work positions, not because he cared about helping children, but because he was a sophisticated predator who understood that summer camps provided ideal opportunities for grooming and abusing young victims. Summer camps presented unique vulnerabilities that Mark was skilled at exploiting. Children were separated from their families for extended periods. They were encouraged to trust their counselors completely, and the isolated wilderness setting made it difficult for victims to seek help or escape dangerous situations. Mark had studied these vulnerabilities carefully and had developed methods for exploiting them while avoiding detection. Mark's approach to selecting victims was methodical and patient. He studied the children in his care, looking for those who seemed lonely, homesick, or eager to please adult authority figures. He was particularly drawn to children who came from troubled homes or who seemed to lack strong support systems, understanding that these children would be less likely to report inappropriate behavior and less likely to be believed if they did speak up. His first target at Camp Wildwood was 12-year-old Tyler Rodriguez, a shy boy who was attending camp for the first time and was struggling to fit in with the other children. Tyler was homesick and anxious, making him particularly vulnerable to Mark's manipulative techniques. Mark began by offering Tyler extra attention and support, positioning himself as a caring adult who understood Tyler's struggles. Mark's grooming of Tyler followed a predictable pattern that he had used successfully at previous camps. He created opportunities for private interaction by volunteering to provide one-on-one instruction in wilderness skills, offering to help Tyler with activities where he was struggling, and creating special privileges that made Tyler feel valued and important. Gradually, Mark began introducing inappropriate behavior into these private interactions, always framing his actions as normal parts of wilderness education or character building. He used his authority as a counselor and his knowledge of child psychology to convince Tyler that their interactions were appropriate and educational, and that Tyler should feel privileged to receive such special attention. Mark's abuse of Tyler escalated over several weeks, during which time he also began targeting other vulnerable children in his care. He was skilled at maintaining his public persona as a dedicated counselor while conducting his criminal activity in settings where discovery was unlikely and where victims could be easily intimidated into silence. The abuse was discovered when Tyler became severely depressed and attempted to harm himself, prompting the camp nurse to recommend that he be sent home early for psychological evaluation. During his assessment with a child psychologist, Tyler eventually disclosed what Mark had been doing to him and described similar behavior toward other children at the camp. The investigation into Mark Thompson revealed a disturbing history of predatory behavior at multiple youth camps over several years. Mark had been moving from camp to camp, using his excellent references and credentials to gain employment, while leaving behind a trail of traumatized children who had been too afraid or confused to report his crimes. Mark's apartment contained evidence of his systematic approach to child abuse, including detailed files on numerous children from various camps, photographs taken without permission, and correspondence with other adults who shared his criminal interests. He had been part of a network of predators who shared information about vulnerable children and opportunities for abuse. During questioning, Mark showed no remorse for his crimes and seemed to view his victims as objects that existed for his gratification, rather than as human beings with their own rights and dignity. He was particularly disturbing in his clinical descriptions of his grooming techniques and his apparent pride in his ability to manipulate children and avoid detection. Mark Thompson was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison on charges including child abuse, exploitation, and transportation of minors across state lines for illegal purposes. The case prompted significant changes in how summer camps screen their staff and monitor interactions between counselors and children. Interactions between counselors and children. Tyler Rodriguez required extensive therapy to recover from the trauma of Mark's abuse and struggled with trust issues that affected his relationships with adults for years. His parents also underwent counseling to learn how to support their son's recovery and to cope with their own guilt over having sent him to a place where he was harmed by someone they trusted to protect him. Camp Wildwood implemented new policies requiring background checks for all staff members, mandatory training on recognizing and preventing child abuse, and strict supervision protocols to ensure that counselors were never alone with individual children. The camp also established new procedures for children to report concerns about staff behavior and created support systems for children who might be struggling with homesickness or other vulnerabilities. The case served as a reminder that predators often specifically seek employment in positions that provide access to children, and that organizations serving young people must be vigilant about screening staff and creating environments where inappropriate behavior can be quickly identified and stopped. Mark Thompson had used the trust that children and parents place in youth counselors to commit serious crimes against vulnerable victims. His case demonstrated the importance of robust safeguarding procedures and the need for ongoing vigilance in protecting children in residential and recreational settings. When renowned pianist Alina Petrov opened her private music studio in the affluent suburb of Brookhaven, parents were thrilled to have access to such high-quality music instruction for their children. Alina had impressive credentials, including training at prestigious conservatories and performances with major orchestras. Her studio quickly became the most sought-after location for piano lessons in the area, with a waiting list of families hoping to secure spots for their musically inclined children. Alina Petrov was a 42-year-old woman who had indeed achieved significant success as a classical pianist before transitioning to teaching. However, her decision to focus on private instruction had nothing to do with a passion for education and everything to do with her desire to gain access to vulnerable children in a setting where she could exercise complete control over their activities and behavior. Alina's teaching studio was designed to create an atmosphere of serious musical study and artistic development. The soundproofed rooms, the requirement for parents to remain in the waiting area during lessons, and the emphasis on individual instruction all seemed like hallmarks of professional music education. In reality, these features provided Alina with the isolation and control she needed to abuse her students. Alina's approach to selecting victims was sophisticated and calculated. She targeted children who showed exceptional musical talent, understanding that their parents would be more likely to tolerate unusual teaching methods if they believed their child was receiving special attention from a renowned instructor. She also looked for families where parents were particularly ambitious about their children's musical development and might be willing to overlook concerning behavior if they believed it would advance their child's career. Her first victim was 9-year-old Isabella Chun. a prodigiously talented pianist whose parents were desperate for her to receive the best possible musical education. Isabella's parents were immigrants who saw their daughter's musical ability as a pathway to opportunities they had never had, making them particularly susceptible to Elena's manipulation. Elena began grooming Isabella by convincing her parents that traditional teaching methods would be insufficient for a child of her exceptional talent. She claimed that Isabella required intensive, personalized instruction that would involve extended lessons, special exercises, and teaching techniques that might seem unusual but were necessary for developing her artistic potential. During private lessons, Elena gradually introduced inappropriate physical contact under the guise of teaching proper posture and technique. She convinced Isabella that these interactions were normal parts of advanced musical training and that students who wanted to achieve greatness had to be willing to accept guidance that might make them uncomfortable initially. Elena also began isolating Isabella from her parents and peers by claiming that she needed to focus entirely on her musical development without distractions. She discouraged Isabella from participating in school activities or social events, arguing that serious musicians had to make sacrifices that ordinary children didn't understand. The abuse escalated over several months, during which time Elena also began targeting other talented students in her studio. She was skilled at maintaining her professional reputation while systematically abusing the children entrusted to her care. Her status as a respected artist and teacher provided her with credibility that made it difficult for anyone to question her methods or motives. Isabella's abuse was discovered when she began exhibiting behavioral changes that concerned her parents. She became withdrawn and anxious, lost interest in activities she had previously enjoyed, and began having nightmares that left her afraid to sleep alone. When her parents questioned her about these changes, Isabella initially refused to discuss what was troubling her. The truth came out during a conversation between Isabella and her older cousin, who noticed that Isabella seemed afraid to go to her piano lessons despite previously being excited about them. When the cousin gently asked about her teacher, Isabella broke down and revealed what Elena had been doing to her during their private lessons. Isabella's parents immediately contacted law enforcement, and the investigation into Elena Petrov revealed the extent of her criminal activity. Several other students came forward with similar stories of abuse, describing how Elena had used her authority as their teacher and her reputation as an artist to manipulate and exploit them. The investigation also revealed that Elena had been videotaping her abuse of students, claiming that the recordings were for educational purposes or to help students review their technique. These recordings provided clear evidence of her crimes and demonstrated the calculated nature of her predatory behavior. Elena's apartment contained extensive files on her students, including detailed notes about their personalities, family situations, and vulnerabilities. She had been studying her victims carefully, developing individualized approaches for grooming and manipulating each child based on their specific circumstances and psychological makeup. During questioning, Elena showed little remorse for her crimes and continued to maintain that her teaching methods were appropriate and necessary for developing serious musical talent. She seemed genuinely confused by the distress her actions had caused and appeared to believe that her victims should have been grateful for the special attention she had provided. Elena Petrov was sentenced to 20 years in prison on multiple charges related to child abuse and exploitation. Her case prompted significant changes in how private music instructors are screened and monitored, with new requirements for background checks and policies governing private instruction of minors. Isabella Shun required extensive therapy to recover from the trauma of Elena's abuse and struggled with her relationship with music for several years. The piano, which had once been a source of joy and pride, became associated with fear and violation. With professional help and the support of her family, Isabella was eventually able to continue her musical studies, but the experience permanently changed her relationship with her art. The case highlighted the vulnerability that exists when children are placed in private instructional settings with adults who have significant authority over their activities and development. It demonstrated the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries in teaching relationships and the need for parents to remain involved in their children's educational experiences, even when working with highly credentialed professionals. Elena Petrov had used her artistic credentials and reputation to gain access to vulnerable children and exploit their trust for her own gratification. Her case served as a reminder that predators can hide behind any profession and that even the most prestigious credentials cannot guarantee that someone is safe to work with children. PowerFit Gym had built its reputation on providing personalized training and achieving remarkable results for its clients. When Jake Sullivan joined their team of personal trainers, he quickly became one of their most popular instructors, particularly among female clients who appreciated his motivational style and apparent dedication to helping them achieve their fitness goals. What his clients didn't know was that Jake was using his position to systematically exploit and abuse the women who trusted him with their physical and emotional well-being. Jake Sullivan was a 31-year-old certified personal trainer who had been working in the fitness industry for over 6 years. He had built an impressive clientele through his combination of fitness expertise, motivational skills, and charming personality. Jake understood that personal training created an environment of trust and vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with predatory intentions. Jake's approach to his work was methodical and calculated. He specifically targeted women who were new to fitness, struggling with body image issues, or going through difficult transitions in their lives, such as divorce or major life changes. These women were often vulnerable and eager for support and validation, making them ideal targets for his manipulative behavior. Jake's method began with establishing himself as not just a fitness trainer, but as a counselor and confidant who cared about all aspects of his clients' well-being. He would engage them in conversations about their personal lives, their insecurities, and their goals, gradually positioning himself as someone who understood them better than anyone else in their lives. His first victim was Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old woman who had recently gone through a difficult divorce and was struggling with depression and low self-esteem. Sarah had joined the gym hoping that exercise would help her regain confidence and improve her mental health. Jake recognized her vulnerability immediately and began tailoring his approach specifically to exploit her emotional needs. Jake convinced Sarah that her fitness goals required a level of personal attention and specialized training that went beyond normal gym sessions. He suggested private training sessions at his home studio, claiming that the gym environment was too distracting for the intensive work she needed to do. He also convinced her that her progress required him to monitor her diet, sleep patterns, and stress levels through regular check-ins and personal conversations. During private training sessions, Jake gradually introduced inappropriate touching under the guise of correcting her form and providing hands-on instruction. He convinced Sarah that this level of physical contact was normal for serious fitness training, and that her discomfort was simply a sign that she wasn't fully committed to her transformation. Jake also began exerting psychological control over Sarah by criticizing her appearance, her effort levels, and her commitment to the program whenever she questioned his methods or seemed resistant to his demands. He alternated between praise and criticism in a way that created an addictive cycle where Sarah became desperate for his approval and validation. The abuse escalated when Jake convinced Sarah that her fitness goals required her to pose for progress, photos that became increasingly inappropriate and exploitative. He claimed that these photos were necessary for tracking her development and that serious athletes regularly submitted to this type of documentation. He used these photos to further manipulate and control Sarah by threatening to share them if she didn't comply with his demands. Sarah's abuse was discovered when her sister noticed dramatic changes in her behavior and appearance. Sarah had become increasingly isolated, anxious, and obsessed with Jake's approval. When her sister expressed concern about Sarah's relationship with her trainer, Sarah initially defended Jake, but eventually broke down and revealed what had been happening during their private sessions. The investigation into Jake Sullivan revealed that Sarah was not his only victim. Over the course of his career, Jake had systematically abused at least 8 women, using nearly identical techniques to exploit their vulnerabilities and maintain control over their behavior. He had been careful to select victims who were unlikely to report his behavior and to create situations where their word would be questioned. If they did speak up, Jake's apartment contained extensive files on his clients, including detailed psychological profiles, inappropriate photographs, and records of their personal information that he had gathered during their sessions. He had been treating his clients like subjects in a psychological experiment, studying their weaknesses and developing customized approaches for exploiting each individual. The investigation also revealed that Jake had been selling intimate photos of his clients to online platforms that specialized in non-consensual intimate content. He had been profiting from his exploitation of these women while simultaneously using their vulnerability to maintain psychological control over their behavior. During questioning, Jake showed no remorse for his crimes and seemed to view his clients as willing participants in consensual relationships rather than victims of systematic abuse. He claimed that the women had benefited from his attention and training, and that their complaints were the result of misunderstanding rather than genuine harm. Jake Sullivan was sentenced to 15 years in prison on charges including sexual assault, extortion, invasion of privacy, and fraud. The case prompted significant changes in how fitness facilities screen their trainers and monitor private training sessions, with new requirements for background checks and policies governing trainer-client relationships. Sarah Mitchell required extensive therapy to recover from the trauma of Jake's abuse and struggled with trust issues that affected her relationships for years. She also had to cope with the knowledge that intimate photos of her had been distributed online without her consent, adding another layer of violation to her experience. PowerFit Gym implemented new policies requiring all private training sessions to be conducted in designated areas with security cameras, mandatory training for staff on appropriate professional boundaries, and clear procedures for clients to report concerns about trainer behavior. The gym also established support resources for clients who might be struggling with personal issues that could make them vulnerable to exploitation. The case served as a reminder that personal training relationships involve significant trust and vulnerability, and that this trust can be exploited by individuals with predatory intentions. It highlighted the importance of maintaining professional boundaries in fitness settings and the need for facilities to protect clients who may be in vulnerable situations. Jake Sullivan had used his position as a fitness trainer to systematically exploit and abuse women who trusted him to help them improve their physical and emotional well-being. His case demonstrated that predators can hide behind any profession that involves personal relationships and physical contact, and that clients must be protected through appropriate policies and oversight. Detective John Harrison had been investigating unsolved murders for 25 years when he received the package that would finally close the case that had haunted him throughout his entire career. The package arrived on a Monday morning with no return address, containing a handwritten letter and a small metal key. The letter began, "Detective Harrison, I know you've been looking for the Riverside Killer for 23 years. It's time you learned the truth. The Riverside Killer had terrorized the small town of Riverside for 6 months in 1999, murdering 5 women in brutal attacks that seemed random and motiveless. The killer had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind no useful evidence and no suspects. The case had remained open but inactive for over 2 decades, with no new leads and no hope of resolution. What made the letter particularly shocking was not just that someone was claiming to know the killer's identity, but that the author provided details about the murders that had never been released to the public. They knew about the specific injuries inflicted on each victim, the unusual items that had been left at each crime scene, and even the order in which the murders had been committed. The letter continued, "I am Margaret Thompson, and I have been living with this secret for 23 years. The Riverside killer was my husband, Robert Thompson. He died last month, and I can finally tell you what really happened to those women." Detective Harrison remembered Robert Thompson clearly. He had been one of hundreds of men interviewed during the investigation, a quiet accountant who lived with his wife in a modest home on the outskirts of town. Robert had been cooperative during questioning, had a solid alibi for most of the murder dates, and had shown no signs of the psychological disturbance that profilers believed the killer would display. Margaret's letter revealed the horrifying truth about her 25-year marriage to a serial killer. She explained that she had discovered Robert's crimes midway through his killing spree, but had been too terrified to report him to authorities. Robert had threatened to kill her if she spoke to anyone about his activities, and he had demonstrated his capacity for violence in ways that left her with no doubt he would follow through on his threats. The small key included with the letter opened a storage unit on the other side of the state, where Margaret had hidden evidence of Robert's crimes for over 2 decades. Inside the unit, Detective Harrison found a collection of items that provided irrefutable proof of Robert's guilt: personal belongings taken from each victim, detailed journals describing the murders, and photographs that Robert had taken as trophies of his crimes. Margaret's letter detailed how she had lived in terror for 23 years, knowing that her husband was a killer but feeling powerless to stop him or escape. She described the psychological torture of having to maintain a normal facade while living with someone she knew was capable of the most brutal violence. She had considered suicide multiple times, but had been too afraid that Robert would kill other people if she wasn't there to monitor his behavior. The evidence Margaret provided allowed Detective Harrison to finally close all 5 murder cases, bringing closure to families who had waited over 2 decades for answers about what had happened to their loved ones. But Margaret's story also raised troubling questions about the costs of keeping such devastating secrets and the psychological toll of living with a monster. Margaret explained in her letter that she had never reported Robert's crimes because she genuinely believed that he would kill her and potentially many other people if she betrayed him. She had seen what he was capable of doing to strangers and knew that his violence toward her would be even more brutal if he discovered her betrayal. During the years following the murders, Margaret had lived in a state of constant vigilance, monitoring Robert's behavior for signs that he might be planning to kill again. She had moved with him to several different states, always watching for indications that his murderous impulses were returning. Fortunately, Robert seemed to have satisfied whatever psychological need had driven him to kill, and he never committed another murder after leaving Riverside.